He grabbed her trunk with one hand and threw it into the dirt like it weighed nothing. "Get out," Jed Calloway said, loud enough for every man on that ranch to hear. "You got no business being here. Never did." Nell Harper stood in the middle of Hollister Ranch's main yard, the Texas sun burning the back of her neck. 37 pairs of eyes watching her from every corner of the property. Her dress was still dusty from the stagecoach. She hadn't even had time to change. She looked at the trunk in the dirt. Then she looked at Jed. She did not move. "I asked to speak with the owner," she said. Her voice was quieter than his, but it didn't shake. "Not you." What happened next would change everything she thought she knew about survival, and about the kind of man who deserves to be feared. If you've ever had everything taken from you before you even got a chance to fight for it, this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. Stay with me until the end, because Nell's story doesn't go where you think it does. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The stagecoach had been 2 days late arriving into Redemption, Texas, which meant Nell Harper had 2 extra days to imagine what her new life would look like. She had spent those hours rereading Silas Croft's letters until the paper started going soft at the folds. He had written in a careful, slightly crooked hand about a farm 20 minutes outside of town, a barn that needed new boards on the east side, a garden that had gone to weeds since his last hand quit. He was not a poetic man. He wrote about practical things. The water table, the soil, the price of seed corn. But there had been something in those letters that Nell couldn't name, a kind of steadiness. She had written back to a stranger for 8 months because his letters felt like ground under her feet when everything else in her life felt like mud. She was 31 years old. She had worked as a seamstress in Cincinnati, then a cook in a boarding house in Missouri, then a farmhand for a family outside of Wichita who paid her in room and board and very little else. She had no family left worth mentioning. Her mother had died when she was 12. Her father had remarried a woman who made it very clear that Nell was a complication, not a child. She was not a woman who felt sorry for herself. That had been trained out of her early, but she was tired, the kind of tired that doesn't fix itself with sleep. When the stagecoach finally pulled into Redemption on a Thursday afternoon in late September, Nell was the last passenger to step down. She had her trunk, her wedding dress folded inside a flour sack, and the address of the preacher who was supposed to marry them. There was nobody waiting at the stop. She thought at first that Silas was simply late. Men who worked farms ran on farm time, not clock time. She sat on her trunk and waited. She watched the other passengers scatter to their destinations. She watched the stagecoach driver unhitch the horses. She watched the street empty. After an hour, she walked to the preacher's house and knocked on the door. The Reverend's wife answered. The look on that woman's face told Nell everything before a single word was spoken. It was the look of someone who had been dreading this exact moment and had rehearsed what to say and still couldn't find the right version of it. "Silas Croft passed 6 weeks ago," the woman said. "Fever. It came on fast. I'm so sorry, honey. We wrote a letter, but I don't suppose it reached you in time." Nell stood on that porch for a moment that felt much longer than it was. "Is there family?" she asked. "A brother in Georgia. He came and took the property." "I see," Nell said. She walked back to her trunk. She sat on it again. The street was quiet except for the sound of a dog somewhere she couldn't see. She had no money for a ticket back east. She had spent nearly everything she'd saved getting here. She had no plan beyond arriving and becoming someone's wife, and now that plan was gone, and she was sitting on a trunk in a town that didn't know her, in a state she'd never been to, with 53 cents and a wedding dress she would never wear. A woman across the street was watching her from a doorway. When Nell met her eyes, the woman stepped back inside and closed the door. That was the town of Redemption's first impression of Nell Harper. A woman sitting on a trunk in the middle of the afternoon looking at nothing. It did not make them feel sympathetic. It made them feel uncomfortable, which in small towns tends to produce the same result as contempt. By the following morning, she had tried 4 doors: a general store, a laundry, a hotel, and a woman named Mrs. Gable, who ran a dress shop and had advertised once, 2 years earlier, for a seamstress's helper. Mrs. Gable opened her door, looked Nell up and down the way a person inspects a piece of fruit they've already decided is overripe, and said, I heard about you, the mail order girl. I'm looking for work, Nell said. I'm sure you are. The woman paused just long enough for the insult to have time to breathe. I don't have anything available. The door closed. Nell stood there for a count of 3. Then she picked up her bag and walked to the next block. The hotel manager told her they didn't hire women without local references. The laundry owner said the position had been filled. The general storekeeper didn't even come out from behind his counter, just shook his head from a distance like she was a beggar. She slept 2 nights in the small room behind the church that the Reverend's wife allowed her out of pity, that was barely a step above charity. On the 3rd morning, she asked the woman if she knew of any ranches or farms hiring. There's Hollister Ranch, the woman said carefully, like she was handling something she didn't want to drop. But I wouldn't. Where is it? Miss Harper, Moss Hollister is not. Which direction? The Reverend's wife sighed. North Road, 7 miles out. But he doesn't hire women for ranch work, and his foreman, Jed Calloway, he's not a kind man when he decides someone isn't worth his time. All right, Nell said, thank you for the room. She walked 7 miles with her bag over her shoulder because she couldn't afford to rent a horse. The Hollister Ranch came into view long before she reached the gate. It was enormous. She had understood that from the Reverend's wife's tone, but understanding something and seeing it were different things. The main house sat on a rise with a long porch across the front. There were at least 4 large outbuildings, multiple corrals, and more horses than she could count at first glance. It was the kind of property that told you exactly what kind of man owned it before you ever met him. Wealth that had been worked for, not inherited. Everything functional and nothing decorative. She was still a quarter-mile out when she heard the screaming. Not human. Horse. Something was wrong in the nearest corral. She could see men crowding the fence, and she could see the shape of a black horse moving in a way that wasn't natural, too frantic, too large in its movements, like it was trying to escape something it couldn't outrun. She didn't slow down. She actually walked faster. By the time she reached the gate, 3 men had already been thrown. One of them was sitting in the dirt holding his arm at an angle that meant it was broken. Another was pressed back against the fence boards, looking at the horse the way men look at things they've already given up on. The black stallion, massive, all muscle and fury, was spinning in the center of the corral, eyes white-rimmed, nostrils flared, moving in tight, panicked circles that kicked up a cloud of dust. Standing just inside the gate was a man who was clearly the foreman. He had the posture of someone who was used to being the largest authority in any given space. I was watching the horse with a cold, evaluating expression, and he was already reaching for the rope in his hand with the kind of deliberate calm that wasn't calm at all. It was the decision that had already been made. Nell stopped at the fence. She watched the horse. The stallion wasn't attacking. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He was cornered, and every time someone moved toward him, he exploded sideways in a blind panic that happened to involve several 100 pounds of muscle. There was a difference, and it mattered. What happened to him? She asked the man nearest the fence. The ranch hand turned to look at her with the specific expression men use when a woman asks a question they've decided is not her business. Lost one of his pasture mates this morning. Spooked bad after. Nobody's been able to get near him. How long has he been like this? Better part of 2 hours. 2 hours. She looked at the horse again. 2 hours of that level of panic in that kind of heat. The stallion's sides were heaving. His legs were moving, but they were starting to lose coordination. He was exhausting himself. Miss. The foreman's voice came from her left. She hadn't heard him approach the fence. He was bigger up close than he'd appeared from a distance, wide through the shoulders, with hands that had spent decades in hard work. His face was not unkind in structure, but his eyes had that particular flatness of a man who had decided he was always the smartest person present. I'm going to need you to step back from this fence. I was watching the horse, she said. I can see that. Step back. He's not going to hurt me if I go in there. The foreman looked at her with an expression that was almost, but not quite, a laugh. That animal has put 3 of my best men in the dirt in the last hour. I don't know where you came from or what you think you know, but you need to step away from this fence right now. He's terrified, not violent, she said. There's a difference. He's been in panic so long he's starting to go weak in the back legs. If someone goes in there swinging a rope at him, he's going to either drop from exhaustion or break his own leg throwing himself at the fence. You're going to lose the horse. The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when a man is angry, but also, despite himself, uncertain. Who are you? he said. My name is Nell Harper. I walked out from town looking for work. I'll deal with the horse if you'll talk to your employer about a position. The foreman stared at her. You'll deal with the horse? Yes. You. His voice had gone flat in a way that wasn't a question. I grew up on a horse farm in eastern Ohio, she said. My father bred working horses for 20 years. I've been handling horses since before I was old enough to look over a fence. I know what I'm looking at. And what are you looking at? A horse that needs someone to stop fighting him. The foreman took a half step closer, and his voice dropped to something that was meant only for her. I don't know what you think is happening here, but this is my ranch, and I don't take advice from women who show up uninvited looking for handouts. So I'm going to say this one more time. Step back from my fence, or I'll have one of my boys escort you off the property. It's not your ranch, said a voice from behind them both. The foreman went still. Nell turned. A man was standing 15 feet away, and she had not heard him approach. I was somewhere in his mid-40s, lean in the way of men who work rather than men who don't eat, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a face that had been in the sun long enough to make it look like it was made of it. He wasn't looking at Nell. He was looking at the horse. Moss, the foreman said. One word, with an entire recalibration inside it. The man named Moss Hollister did not acknowledge him. He walked to the fence, stopped beside Nell, and watched the black stallion for a moment without speaking. He's been like this all morning, he said finally, quietly. Not to Jed, to himself maybe. He's running out of gas, Nell said. If nobody does anything useful in the next 20 minutes, he's going to hurt himself. Moss looked at her then. His eyes were a dark gray that she would have called blue in certain light. He looked at her the way a man looks at something unexpected. Not hostile, but careful, measuring. Jed tells me you said you can handle him. I said someone needs to stop fighting him. I can do that. On what basis? On the basis that I've been watching him for 10 minutes and I know what he needs. Which is? Quiet. And someone who isn't afraid of him. Moss was quiet for a moment. The horse screamed again from inside the corral, and every man on that fence line took an involuntary step back. Every man except Moss, who didn't move at all. What do you want in exchange? He said. Work. Whatever you've got. I'm not particular about what kind. Behind them, Jed made a sound in his throat that was not quite words. Moss didn't turn around. Jed. She's a stranger, Jed said. We don't know a thing about her. She walks in off the road, and you're going to let her. Jed. The second time was quieter, and somehow that made it more final. The foreman went silent. Moss looked back at the corral, then at Nell. His name is Obsidian. He's been on this ranch 4 years, and I've never once seen him like this. His pasture mate died this morning of colic. They'd been together since they were 2 years old. Nell felt something shift in her chest. She understood that kind of loss. Not the horse kind. The other kind. I know, she said. Moss held her gaze for another moment. Then he stepped back from the fence and said, All right. She set down her bag. She opened the corral gate. She walked in alone. Jed grabbed the gate behind her. You're going to get yourself killed, and then I'm going to spend the rest of the month explaining it to the county sheriff. She didn't answer him. She didn't look at the horse right away. She walked to the center of the corral, stopped, and turned so that she was standing sideways. Not facing Obsidian, not turning her back on him. She kept her hands loose at her sides. She made herself breathe slowly, deeply, audibly, so that her breathing became the loudest thing in the space. The stallion stopped his circling and looked at her. She didn't look back. She looked at a spot on the fence just past him. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then Obsidian took one step toward her. She didn't move. He stopped. She kept breathing, slow, even, like she had nowhere to be and nothing to worry about. And this corral was the most comfortable place she'd ever stood. The horse took another step. Behind her, through the fence boards, she heard nothing. No voices, no movement. Every man on that property had gone completely silent. Obsidian walked to within 5 feet of her and stopped. She turned her head, slowly, and looked at him directly for the first time. He was beautiful in the way of things that are beautiful because they are dangerous. Black so pure it was almost blue in the afternoon light. Every muscle in his body was trembling, still running hot from 2 hours of panic. I know, she said very quietly. I know. She lifted her hand. He flinched, took a half step back. She held her hand where it was and waited. After a long moment, Obsidian stretched his neck forward and touched his muzzle to her palm. The sound that came from the fence line was not applause and it was not silence. It was the sound of a group of men exhaling at the same time, which is one of those things that can't quite be described, but which once heard is never forgotten. Nell stayed in that corral for another 20 minutes, just standing with the stallion's head slowly dropping lower beside her, the trembling in his body gradually quieting. When she finally walked to the gate and let herself out, her legs were shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of holding herself that still for that long. Jed was at the gate. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. It wasn't admiration. It was closer to the look a man gets when something has happened that he was sure was impossible and now has to find a different reason to reject. "Beginner's luck," he said. She picked up her bag. Moss Hollister was standing 10 feet away. He was looking at her with that same careful, measuring expression he'd had before. But there was something else in it now that hadn't been there at the beginning. "There's a bunkhouse room that's been empty since spring," he said. "Meals are at 6 and noon. I'll have someone show you where things are." "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Jed runs the operation. You'll answer to him." She looked at the foreman. The foreman looked at her. She had made one ally on this ranch, and she could already see exactly how much trouble that was going to cause. The bunkhouse room they gave Nell was barely large enough to turn around in. There was a cot with a mattress that had been restuffed so many times it had given up trying to be even, a single nail in the wall for hanging things, and a small window that faced the back of the hay barn. The window didn't open all the way. The latch was broken and someone had jammed a piece of wood into the frame to hold it at a fixed angle that let in approximately enough air to keep a person alive but not comfortable. She put her trunk at the foot of the cot. She sat down. The mattress sagged immediately to the left. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was just rough-cut boards with a spider doing something complicated in one corner, and then she unpacked what she needed for the morning and lay down with her boots still on because she wasn't sure the floor was clean enough to walk on in stockings. She was asleep in 4 minutes. She had not slept that fast or that deeply in a month. That was the first thing Hollister Ranch gave her. A place tired enough to match her. She was up before the cook's bell. She found the pump behind the bunkhouse, washed her face and hands in water so cold it made her teeth ache, and made her way to the cookhouse before the light had fully arrived. The cook was a man named Darnell, somewhere north of 60, with the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades over a fire and was not inclined to be cheerful about it. He looked at her when she came through the door, looked at what she was wearing, looked back at the pan he was working, and said nothing. She asked if there was anything she could do. He told her she could stay out of his way. She stayed out of his way and poured herself coffee from the pot on the back of the stove and stood in the corner and drank it. She was on her second cup when the first ranch hands started coming in, and that was when she understood exactly what she had walked into. There were 14 of them. She would learn their names over the next few days, but right then they were just 14 men filing into a cookhouse who all stopped when they saw her and went through the same series of expressions in roughly the same order. Surprise. Appraisal. Dismissal. A man called Reuben, who she would later learn had been on the ranch 11 years and considered himself the informal second-in-command of everything that Jed wasn't directly managing, sat down across the room from her and said to nobody in particular, "Did somebody order a housekeeper?" 3 men laughed. Nell drank her coffee. Darnell dropped a heavy pan onto the iron stove with enough force to rattle every dish in the building, and the laughter stopped. Whether that was intentional or not, she couldn't tell. She decided to believe it was. Jed came in last. He saw her in the corner with her coffee and his face went through a shorter version of the same sequence. Surprise, appraisal, and then something that settled into an expression she would get very familiar with over the coming weeks. It was the expression of a man who had a plan and intended to outlast her. He sat down without acknowledging her, and for the next 20 minutes ran through the morning assignments with his men. She wasn't included in any of them. She wasn't spoken to. She was furniture that hadn't been decided on yet. After the men filed out, she approached him. "What would you like me to do today?" she asked. He chewed the last of his biscuit, took a drink of coffee, set the cup down with great deliberateness. "What are you good at?" "Horses, mostly, but I can cook, sew, handle livestock generally, repair tack. I've got men for all of that." "Then tell me what you don't have men for." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly, more like the beginning of one that didn't commit. Laundry's been piling up since the last hired woman left. Bunkhouse floors need scrubbing. There's a pile of tack in the storage room that needs cleaning and conditioning. She had done harder things for less. Fine, she said. He seemed almost disappointed that she'd said it. She did the laundry, she did the floors, she did the tack. It took her until mid-afternoon, working alone in a storage room that smelled of old leather and lanolin, sorting through bridles and saddles that hadn't been properly cared for in weeks. Some of the leather was cracking along the seams. She cleaned everything, conditioned what needed conditioning, and left the rest organized on the proper hooks in an order that made sense, by horse size and function, rather than just jammed wherever it had been dropped. Nobody thanked her. Nobody noticed. At dinner, she was on her second bowl of Darnell's beef stew, which was actually very good, something she mentioned to him directly, which made him look at her as though she had said something slightly suspicious, when one of the younger ranch hands sat down a few feet away. I was maybe 20, with a gap between his front teeth and the permanent sunburned expression of someone who spent too much time squinting into the wind. His name was Tommy Briggs, she would learn, and he was the only person on that ranch who seemed to have been born without the instinct for cruelty. "You're the one who walked in with obsidian today," he said. "That was me," she said. "I never seen anybody do that." He said it flatly, the way young men say things they find genuinely astonishing but don't want to appear astonished by. He just needed someone to stop pushing at him. Tommy considered this while eating. "Jed's been after Mr. Hollister to sell him for 2 years. Says he's too dangerous to keep around." She kept her expression neutral. "Is that right?" "Mr. Hollister won't do it, though. He bought that horse himself, trained him from a colt. Or tried to." He paused. "Wasn't going very well till today, I guess." She ate the rest of her dinner without asking more questions, because she was starting to understand that information in this place was currency, and she didn't yet know enough to spend any of it wisely. She went back to Obsidian's corral after dinner when the light was going orange and the heat had finally started letting go of the day. She stood at the fence and watched him. He was still moving restlessly, still carrying the grief of the morning in his body, but he was calmer than he'd been. When he noticed her at the fence, he stopped. He looked at her. She didn't go in. She just stood there. After a few minutes, he walked over and put his muzzle against the fence rail near her hand. "All right," she said quietly. "All right." She stayed until it was too dark to see clearly. When she turned to walk back to the bunkhouse, Moss Hollister was standing 20 feet behind her. She startled. She hadn't heard him, which bothered her because she'd always had good ears. He was just standing there with his hands in his pockets looking at the corral, and for a moment she wasn't sure how long he'd been there. "He doesn't usually do that," Moss said. "Come to the fence like that." "He'll settle," she said. "It takes time when they lose a companion that way." Moss didn't say anything for a moment. He was still looking at the corral, not at her. "His dam was a horse my wife picked out. She had a good eye for horses." He stopped, like he hadn't meant to say that much. Nell didn't respond to it directly. There are things people tell you that aren't invitations, just sounds that got out before they could stop them. She'd learned the difference. "I'll check on him again in the morning," she said. She went back to her room. She lay on the lopsided mattress and stared at the ceiling and thought about what Tommy had said, about Jed wanting Moss to sell the horse, about 2 years of asking. She thought about the way Jed had looked at her from across the cookhouse that morning, the particular quality of his patience, the way it wasn't patience at all, but something being held in reserve. She turned over and went to sleep, because worrying in the dark had never once helped anything. The next 2 weeks were the kind of hard that doesn't announce itself as hard. It just accumulates, like debt. Every morning she was up before the bell. Every morning she reported to Jed for her assignments, which were always the domestic tasks: laundry, cleaning, mending, kitchen help when Darnell allowed it. She was never assigned to the horses. She was never included in the real work of the ranch, the work that mattered to the men who did it. But every evening she went to Obsidian. She started bringing a small stool and sitting near the fence. She talked to him the way she used to talk to her father's horses when she was a child, which was essentially the same way she talked to herself, narrating whatever was on her mind, not expecting a response, just filling the air with something that wasn't threat or demand. She told him about Cincinnati. She told him about the boarding house in Missouri and the woman who ran it who had strong opinions about soup temperature. She told him about the letters from Silas Croft, about the weeks on the road getting here, about the 2 nights she'd slept in the Reverend's back room. Obsidian would stand near her, head low, ears occasionally flicking toward her voice. On the 8th day, he let her put her hand on his neck. She felt the muscles under his skin, still tight, still carrying something, but beginning to soften at the edges. On the 10th day, she put a halter on him without any protest at all. She didn't make a point of it. She didn't call anyone over to witness it. She took the halter off, thanked him quietly, put the stool away, and went to bed. But Tommy saw it from across the yard. And what Tommy saw, Reuben eventually heard about. And what Reuben eventually heard about, Jed knew by morning. She was scrubbing the cookhouse floor when Jed came to stand in the doorway. She could tell by the sound of his footsteps. Jed walked a certain way, like each step was a small decision he was winning, that something had shifted. "I hear you haltered Obsidian last night," he said. She kept scrubbing. "I did." "Without permission." She stopped. She looked up at him. "I was at the fence. I had a halter. He let me put it on." "That animal is not your concern." "He was nobody's concern when I got here," she said. "He was a horse nobody could touch, running himself into the ground every afternoon. I've been working with him on my own time. I didn't think I needed permission for that." Jed came 2 steps into the room. "Everything on this property requires permission. That includes that horse, that fence, and that stool I see you dragging out there every night." She put the brush down. She stood up. When she was standing, they were approximately the same height, which she could see bothered him slightly. "All right," she said. Then I'm asking, permission to continue working with Obsidian." "Denied." "May I ask why?" "Because he's a dangerous animal, and you are a domestic hire, and if he puts you through a fence board, I'm the one who has to explain it to the county." "He's not going to Denied, Miss Harper." He said it with the finality of a man closing a door he intended to lock. "You touch that horse again without being told to, I'll take it up with Mr. Hollister directly." He left. She stood in the middle of the cookhouse floor for a long moment. Then she picked up the brush and kept scrubbing, because the floor still needed to be done, and having an enemy hadn't changed that. She didn't go to Obsidian that evening, or the evening after. She went to the fence, stood there for a few minutes, watched him come over looking for her, and forced herself to walk away. It was one of the harder things she'd done on this property, and she'd been doing hard things steadily since she got here. On the 3rd evening of staying away from the corral, Moss found her sitting on the back step of the bunkhouse watching the last light go out of the sky. "Jed tells me he had to speak with you about the stallion," he said. "He did," she said. Moss sat down on the step below her, which put him at a slightly lower level, and she had the sense that this was not accidental even though it probably was. He was not a man who arranged things for effect. He was too practical for that. "He says you were working with the horse without authorization." "I was sitting near a fence talking to an animal. I didn't realize that required a work order." Something moved briefly across his face. "He's not wrong that the horse is dangerous." "He's not dangerous," she said, and she was careful to keep her voice even, but she couldn't keep all of the feeling out of it. "He's frightened. Those aren't the same thing, and the fact that nobody on this ranch seems to know the difference is why he's been unmanageable for 4 years. Moss was quiet. "I'm not trying to overstep," she said. "I understand I was hired for the house, and the laundry, and the mending. I've done all of that. I do it every day without being asked twice. But I know that horse, Mr. Hollister. I've been working with horses my entire life, and I know what he is and what he needs. And what he needs is exactly what Jed won't let me give him." The silence between them stretched out long enough that a cricket started up somewhere under the step. "What does he need?" Moss said finally. She looked at him directly. "Time. Patience. Someone willing to let him decide when he's ready instead of forcing the decision. You can't fight a horse into trust. You have to wait it out." Moss looked at his hands, which were resting on his knees. They were scarred in the way of working hands, knuckles thickened, one finger bent at an angle that had healed slightly wrong. "He let you halter him," he said. "Yes." "How many people do you think could do that right now?" "On this ranch? Honestly? Just me." She wasn't being arrogant. She was being accurate, and she thought he knew the difference. Moss was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, "I'll talk to Jed." "I don't need special treatment," she said quickly. "I just need to not be banned from the fence." "I'll talk to Jed," he said again.
He got up and went inside. She sat on the step until the cricket was joined by several others, and the yard was fully dark. She didn't know what Moss said to Jed that night, and she never would. But the next morning, Jed walked past her in the cookhouse without speaking, which was new. Previously, he had always had something to say. And that afternoon, Tommy came and told her quietly that she'd been assigned to help with the horses in the East Corral starting the following week. It wasn't much. It was everything. She was good with them. That wasn't vanity. It was just the plain fact of it. The ranch hands noticed, even the ones who didn't want to. A horse that had been favoring its left foreleg for 2 weeks, that 3 men had looked at and shrugged, she caught in the first 5 minutes of watching it move. A stone bruise, working up toward the frog, not infected yet, but close. She told Reuben, who told Jed, who told someone to deal with it, and nobody mentioned where the information had come from, but Reuben looked at her differently after that. Jed watched all of this with the stillness of a man who was keeping score. She felt it. Not constantly, not in every moment, but regularly enough that it was always somewhere in the back of her awareness. The sense of being measured by someone who had already decided what verdict he wanted and was just waiting for the evidence to arrange itself. She didn't give him anything she could avoid giving him. She was never late. She was never careless. She never left a job half done or passed a problem to someone else that she could fix herself. She was not trying to be perfect. She couldn't be perfect. Nobody could. And she made mistakes the way anyone does. Miscounted feed rations one afternoon, misjudged a young mare's mood badly enough to get kicked in the thigh that left a bruise she could feel for a week. But she owned the mistakes. She fixed what she could fix and told someone when she couldn't. 3 weeks in, she was walking Obsidian in the near pasture on a lead line. Just walking. The horse was moving beside her like they'd been doing it for years. She didn't notice Moss at the fence until Obsidian's ear swiveled. She looked up. He was watching from the rail with an expression that was impossible to read at that distance, and she lifted a hand in brief acknowledgement, and he nodded once. She went back to walking the horse. That was all it was. But something about it stayed with her through the rest of the afternoon in a way she couldn't quite explain to herself and didn't try to. The trouble started on a Tuesday, which seemed appropriate somehow. Nothing good ever broke on a Tuesday, but bad things always seemed to find their footing there. She was in the storage room checking the tack she'd organized in her first week, making sure nothing had been thrown back into disorder, which it had, because people always find a way to return a system to chaos if given enough time, when she heard Jed and Reuben talking on the other side of the wall. Not arguing, talking, in the low, deliberate way of men who are deciding something. She wasn't trying to listen. She was trying to avoid making noise while she sorted through a pile of incorrectly hung bridles. She caught her own name. She stopped moving entirely. "Don't trust it," Jed was saying. "Woman shows up out of nowhere. No people, no references, no history." "She knows horses," Reuben said. His voice carried a resistance to wherever Jed was going, though not a strong one. "Knowing horses is one thing. What she's doing with Hollister is another." "She hasn't done anything with Hollister. Not yet." A pause. Footsteps, the slow kind of a man who is thinking while moving. "You know what she is? She's a woman who came here with nothing and figured out that the fastest road to something is through him, and the horse is her way in." Reuben was quiet. "I've been here 14 years, Jed said. 14 years. I know how this place runs. I know what this ranch needs and what it doesn't need, and what it doesn't need is a woman with no history turning Moss's head around a horse." "Jed," Reuben said carefully, "she's cleaning tack and managing laundry, and for now," Jed said, "for now she is." She heard them move away. She stayed where she was for a full minute, bridle in her hand, not moving. Then she hung it on the proper hook and kept working. Because what else was there to do? She told herself that Jed's opinion of her was his own problem. She told herself that she was doing her job and doing it well, and that was what mattered. She believed both of these things with varying levels of conviction depending on the day. What she didn't fully account for was how much power a man like Jed had in a place like this. Not the formal power, not the kind that came from Moss trusting him, but the informal kind. The power of being the person who set the daily temperature of a working environment, who decided which conversations happened and which didn't, who controlled the small frictions and the small dignities that made the difference between a day that was merely hard and a day that was actively miserable. He never did anything she could point to directly.
He never spoke to her with outright cruelty in front of others after that first day. He was smarter than that. What he did was subtler. Assignments that were slightly more degrading than necessary, information about the day's work that somehow reached everyone except her, small errors in her work exaggerated when they reached Moss, and small successes that simply never made it to him. She started keeping track. Not on paper. In her head. She had always had a good memory, and she started using it the way you'd use a ledger, cataloging what was being done, and by whom, and when. Building a picture she didn't yet know what to do with. The ranch hands were a mixed situation. Some of them had softened toward her, Tommy obviously, a couple of the older men who had been around long enough to value competence over form. Most of them were neutral in the way of men who have learned that taking sides in a workplace disagreement costs more than it gains. A few had taken their cue from Jed without examining the cue too closely, which was the most human thing imaginable and also the most frustrating. Reuben was the complicated one. She could tell he was fair-minded in his bones. He had that quality of a man who genuinely didn't like injustice. But he had 14 years of loyalty to Jed that ran deeper than fairness. Every time she made progress with him, she could feel Jed quietly rolling it back. She had been on the ranch 5 weeks when the sick horse happened. It started early, before she even got to the corrals. She was on her way from the bunkhouse to the cookhouse when she noticed Obsidian standing at the far end of his pasture, which was wrong. He always stood near the gate in the morning because he'd started expecting her to walk past. She stopped and looked at him. He was standing still in a way that wasn't rest. It was the stillness of something not right, legs slightly splayed, head lower than natural. She changed direction. She went to the pasture fence instead of the cookhouse and climbed over. He didn't come to her. That alone told her enough. She walked to him, watched his breathing, put her hand on his side and felt the heat there and the tension in the muscle beneath, and felt the way his belly was distended on the left, and watched the dull, flat look in his eye where there was usually something alive and watchful. Her stomach dropped. She knew what this was. She'd seen it before. Twice on her father's farm, once on the property in Wichita. It moved fast when it moved, and the worst thing you could do was wait. She ran back to the bunkhouse, hammered on doors until she found Tommy, and told him to get Moss immediately, right now, not after breakfast, right now. Then she went back to the pasture. By the time Moss arrived, 6 men were standing at the fence looking at the horse, with the particular useless paralysis of people who can see something is wrong and have no idea what to do about it. Jed was among them. His face was carefully neutral. "He's colicking," Nell said before Moss could speak. "The left side is distended and he's got no gut sounds on that side. This is an early stage." "You're certain?" Moss said. "Yes." She looked at him. "We need to walk him. Keep him moving. If he goes down and rolls, it can twist the gut, and then there's nothing to be done. We need someone to get a vet if there's one within riding distance, and we need to do it right now." Jed stepped forward. "We don't know that this is... It's colic," she said. She didn't look at him. "I've seen it twice. I know what it looks like." "You're not a vet," Jed said. "No, which is why I said someone needs to get one." She looked back at Moss. "Please." Moss looked at Obsidian for 3 seconds that felt much longer. The horse stood in his miserable stillness, swishing his tail against a discomfort too large to dismiss. Moss had owned him for 4 years, had bought him as a colt because of something his wife had said about the look in the animal's eye, had watched him be unmanageable and difficult and dangerous, and had never once agreed to sell him. "Tommy," Moss said, "ride to town. Get Doc Weller if he's there, Addison if he's not." "Yes, sir." Tommy was already moving. "Reuben, clear the south walk. I want a long, straight stretch." Reuben went without a word. Moss looked at Jed. Something passed between them that Nell couldn't fully read. Jed's jaw tightened slightly. Then he stepped back from the fence. Moss looked at Nell. "You lead him," he said. "Tell me what you need." She went into the pasture and put the halter on Obsidian, moving slowly and talking the whole time, keeping her voice at the same pitch she'd used every evening at the fence. The horse leaned into her hands with a kind of desperate trust that made something in her chest hurt. "We're going to walk," she told him. "Just walk, that's all." She led him out the gate. For the next 4 hours, she walked. Moss walked beside her for much of it, and she told him what to watch for, when to be worried, and when it was just normal discomfort, how to read the signs that things were improving or getting worse. She talked as much to fill the silence as to inform him, because silence right now felt dangerous. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He asked 2 questions, both practical, both the right ones. Jed watched from the fence. Around the 3rd hour, Obsidian's gut started making sounds again. She stopped walking. She put her ear against his flank and listened. Then she closed her eyes for a second. "Movement," she said. "There's movement." Moss stood close enough that she could feel the tension in him when she said it. He let out a breath. "Good?" he asked. "Good," she said. "It means things are starting to move the way they should. We keep walking for another hour, and then we'll see." She looked at him. He was closer than she'd realized, close enough that she could see the lines in his face that weren't from age but from years of sun and hard weather, the shadows under his eyes that came from whatever he'd been carrying long before she arrived. He looked back at her. "Thank you," he said quietly. Not the official, employer-to-employee kind, the other kind. She looked away. "We should keep moving." They kept moving. Doc Weller arrived 90 minutes later, examined the horse, and confirmed everything she'd said. Colic, left side displacement, caught early enough that walking had likely saved the animal's life. He gave Obsidian a treatment, left instructions, charged a substantial fee that Moss paid without comment. Before he left, Doc Weller looked at Nell and said, "Where'd you train?" "My father's farm," she said. "Eastern Ohio." He nodded slowly. "Somebody taught you right." She thought about her father, about the freezing mornings in a barn that was never warm enough, her hands too small for the work he was showing her, him crouched beside her in the straw, explaining what every sound and posture and behavior meant, patient in the way he was patient with almost nothing else. "Yes," she said. They did. Doc Weller left. Reuben walked past her without looking directly at her, which was his specific version of acknowledgement. 2 other men caught her eye and nodded. Tommy gave her a grin that he immediately tried to make less obvious. Jed said nothing. He walked back toward the main yard with the even deliberate steps of a man who was recalculating, and she watched him go and felt the small cold certainty that what had just happened, Moss following her instructions, a whole crew watching, the horse still on his feet, had not helped her situation with Jed Calloway. It had made it worse. She was right. She just didn't know yet how much worse it was going to get, or how fast. Obsidian recovered steadily. By the end of the week, he was eating normally and moving with the easy arrogance that healthy horses carry as their natural birthright. She continued working with him every afternoon now, without anyone trying to stop her, walking him, working on basic maneuvers, introducing a saddle blanket with the patience of someone who understood that 5 minutes of progress done correctly was worth more than an hour of progress forced. The ranch had changed around her in ways that were subtle but real. Conversations that used to stop when she walked up now continued. Men asked her things, not regularly, not always comfortably, but occasionally and genuinely. Questions about horses they were concerned about feed issues, about the twitch of behavior they'd noticed and didn't know how to read. She answered honestly and without making them feel foolish for asking, which was harder than it sounds because some of the questions were things she'd known since she was 10 years old. But she'd been on the other side of being made to feel stupid for not knowing something, and she didn't want to be the kind of person who passed that feeling along. Moss started talking to her in the evenings. Not every evening, not for long. Sometimes it was just 5 minutes at the fence watching Obsidian move, him asking something practical about the horse, her answering. But sometimes it was longer. He told her about the ranch in fragments, the way people tell things when they haven't told them in a while and are out of practice. The history of it, how his father had started it with 400 acres and a bad temper, how Moss had grown it by knowing when to wait and when to push. He told her once, carefully and briefly, about his wife. Clara. She had died 5 years ago. He said it the way people say things they've said many times and are still not used to saying. She told him about Cincinnati, about the seamstress work, about the boarding house. She told him about Silas Croft's letters, which she'd been careful not to mention to anyone on the ranch because she felt it made her sound exactly as foolish as the town had decided she was. Moss listened without judgment, which was not something she had expected of him. "You crossed the whole country for a man you'd never met," he said. Not a criticism, just a statement with something behind it she couldn't quite name. "I crossed the country for a chance at something settled," she said. He was just attached to the idea. Moss was quiet. And when it didn't work out, I found somewhere else to be, she said. He looked at her. For just a second, there was something in his face that was open in a way she hadn't seen from him before, and then it was gone, carefully put back wherever he kept it. You're good with the horses, he said. Thank you. Better than anyone I've hired. Better than most people I've seen. She didn't know what to do with that, so she said, Obsidian is going to be ready to ride in about 3 weeks, maybe 4, if you want to do it right. Do it right, he said immediately. That's what I thought, she said. She went back to her room and lay on the lopsided mattress and looked at the spider's corner of the ceiling, which had gotten considerably more complicated since her first night. Outside the window, the ranch was settling into its nighttime sounds. A horse moving in the near pasture, a door somewhere, wind off the flat land beyond the fence line. She was not home. She had no idea if she would ever be home anywhere. But she was somewhere. And somewhere right now was more than she'd had a month ago. She closed her eyes. In the morning, she had work to do. 3 weeks after Obsidian survived the colic, Nell saddled him for the first time. She didn't make an announcement. She didn't ask anyone to watch. She simply arrived at the pasture early on a Wednesday morning before the breakfast bell, before most of the ranch was moving, and spent 40 minutes doing what she'd been doing every day, walking him, working with him, letting him settle into her presence the way a person settles into a chair they know well. Then she brought the saddle. She introduced it the same way she'd introduced everything else, not forcing, not rushing. She let him smell it, investigate it, decide it wasn't a threat before she ever tried to put it on his back. When she finally set it in place and reached under for the cinch, he turned his head and looked at her with one dark eye, and she said, I know, it's strange. Give it a minute. He gave it a minute. She tightened the cinch slowly, talking the whole time, and then she stood back and watched him move around the pasture with it on. He wasn't happy about it. He flattened his ears twice and his tail worked in irritated sweeps. But he didn't buck. He didn't panic. He was expressing an opinion, which was different, and she let him express it and kept her own body relaxed and waited until his ears came forward again. 20 minutes later, she put her foot in the stirrup. She didn't swing up immediately. She put weight in the stirrup and waited. Obsidian shifted but held. She took her foot out, put it back, took it out again. Did this 7 times before she finally came up and settled into the saddle with the careful, unhurried movement of someone who had done this exact thing with difficult horses more times than she could count. Obsidian stood absolutely still. She sat there for 10 seconds, doing nothing, just breathing. Then she asked him forward with the lightest possible pressure from her legs, and he walked. She rode him for 8 minutes that first morning, just walking, just circles and straight lines in the early light, the two of them finding the language of it together, each adjustment she made meeting a response from him that was cautious but willing. When she dismounted and took the saddle off, she pressed her forehead briefly against his neck the way she used to do with her father's horses when she was a child, and felt the warmth of him and the specific smell of horse sweat and morning air. Good, she told him. That was good. She turned around to find Tommy standing at the pasture fence with his mouth open. Close your mouth, she said. You'll catch something. You just rode Obsidian, he said. I walked Obsidian. There's a difference. She carried the saddle back toward the barn. Don't make a production of it. He made a production of it. By noon, the entire ranch knew. By dinner, the story had already grown in the retelling to include details that hadn't happened. She'd supposedly cantered him, supposedly jumped a fence rail, supposedly done it all without a halter. None of that was true, but she'd learned by now that the truth on a working ranch was a flexible thing, especially when it came to stories that people wanted to be larger than they were. What she hadn't anticipated was how it would land with Jed. She was hanging laundry, still her job, still her daily reality, regardless of what else she'd taken on, when he came to stand at the corner of the building and watch her. Not approaching, just standing. She kept working. I heard about this morning, he said finally. I assumed you would. Mr. Hollister know you were doing that? He told me to take my time with it and do it right. I took my time and did it right. Jed was quiet for a moment that she could feel the shape of even without looking at him. You've made yourself comfortable here, he said. She took a sheet off the line that had finished drying and folded it. I've done my job. You've done more than your job, that's the point. She stopped folding and looked at him directly. Is that a problem? It is when it creates confusion about what someone's role is. My role, she said carefully, is whatever is needed. You told me yourself in the first week that you'd tell me what to do, and I'd do it. I've done everything you've told me to do. I've also done other things when I saw they needed doing. I don't think that's a problem. You're spending time with the owner, he said. Evening time. She looked at him for a long moment. I'm at the fence with a horse, and he's there. Sometimes. Regularly, Jed said. His voice was even, which was somehow worse than if it had been heated. You need to understand something, Miss Harper. I have nothing against you personally. You've worked hard and you know horses. I'll grant you that. But this is a ranch that runs on order, clear lines, everybody knowing their place. And right now those lines are getting blurry in ways that are going to cause problems. She finished folding the sheet. She set it in the basket. She picked up the next piece and kept working. I hear you, she said, which was not the same as agreeing with him, and they both knew it. He left without another word. She finished the laundry and went about her afternoon and told herself that Jed Calloway had been managing this ranch for 14 years and had a certain vision of how it should function, and that she was something that didn't fit that vision, and that this was a problem she was going to have to navigate for as long as she was here. She told herself all of this reasonably and calmly. She also went back to Obsidian after dinner and rode him again in the last of the light, and this time he trotted for 3 strides before she asked him back to a walk, and she felt that in her whole body like something coming back to life after a long winter. Moss was at the fence when she came out of the pasture. How is he? Moss asked. Better every day, she said. She ran up the stirrups, loosened the cinch. He's got a good mind when somebody bothers to find it. I've had 4 trainers try with him, Moss said. He was leaning on the top rail with his arms crossed, watching the horse graze. 2 of them said he was unworkable. 2 of them were wrong. He looked at her with something close to amusement. It changed his face considerably. That near smile made him look younger than the weather had made him appear, and almost approachable in a way he usually managed to avoid. You don't say much that you don't mean, he said. I find it saves time. He was quiet for a moment. The light was going gold and then pink along the horizon in the way the Texas sky did this time of year, which was one of the few things about this state that was straightforwardly beautiful without any of the complications. Jed says you've been taking on more than your assigned work, Moss said. She kept her expression neutral. Did he? He's not wrong. No, she said. He's not. I'm not criticizing, Moss said. I'm telling you I know, and I think you should know that I know. She looked at him. This was one of those moments where what wasn't being said was larger than what was, and she was experienced enough with such moments to let it stay that way. All right, she said. She picked up the saddle. Nell? She stopped. He didn't say anything else for a second, like he'd started the sentence without being sure where it was going. You've done well here, he said finally. Better than I expected. Better than most. She thought about the laundry and the floor scrubbing and the endless tack cleaning and the 4 weeks of being invisible to every man on the property except as an obstacle or an inconvenience. She thought about what it had cost her to build what small amount of ground she was standing on. Thank you, she said. And then, because she couldn't help it, though that might say more about your expectations than about me. He looked at her. And this time the near smile completed itself, briefly and fully, and then went away again. She carried the saddle back to the barn and went to bed and didn't examine the evening too closely, which was the only intelligent thing she could do with it. October arrived and brought a change in the air that was more promise than reality. The temperature dropped slightly at night, but the days still hit the high 80s, and the land had that dry, held-breath quality of a place waiting for rain that wasn't sure it was coming. The grass in the far pastures was going from yellow to brown at the tips. Moss had the men rotating the horses through the water access more frequently, and Nell noticed he'd been spending more time riding the fence lines checking for breaks, which meant he was worried about the herd in ways he wasn't advertising. She mentioned it to him one evening, not the worry itself, but what she'd observed. South Fence has got a quarter-mile section that's been repaired twice in the last year, she said. I saw it when you had me help move the bay geldings last week. The posts are going soft at the base. He looked at her. You noticed that. Hard not to. I had Reuben look at it. Reuben looked at the wire, she said. The problem is the posts. You can repair the wire all you want, but if the posts give out in a strong wind, you're going to lose a section, and if the weather turns the way it looks like it might,
You could have a strong wind sooner than you'd planned for." He was quiet for a moment.
"I'll have a crew on it this week," he said. 2 days later, she saw the crew out there with new posts and a post hole digger. Jed watched her that afternoon from across the yard with an expression she was getting better at reading. It was the expression of someone doing arithmetic and not liking the numbers. She had started, without quite deciding to, keeping better track of Jed Calloway. Not obsessively, but methodically. The way her father had taught her to track a herd, not staring directly, which spooked them, but maintaining a consistent peripheral awareness so that changes in behavior registered before they became problems. She noted when Jed's conversations with the men grew longer and quieter. She noted who he talked to alone and who he didn't bother with. She noted the 3 or 4 men who seemed to orbit him most closely. Reuben was one, though Reuben's orbit was looser than it used to be, she thought. A man named Cord was another. Cord was 28, had been on the ranch 6 years, and had the specific loyalty of someone who had been given a lot of chances he wasn't sure he deserved and was grateful to whoever had given them. She was careful not to move against Jed directly. She had nothing concrete, and even if she had, going to Moss with concerns about his foreman would look like exactly what Jed had accused her of. A woman using proximity to the owner to gain an advantage she hadn't earned. She couldn't afford that. So she watched, and she worked, and she waited for something to become clear. What became clear instead was the storm. It announced itself 4 days in advance the way serious Texas storms do. Not with visible clouds, but with a particular quality of the air, a pressure change that the horses felt before any human instrument could measure it. Obsidian was restless 3 days before the weather broke. She mentioned it to Moss, who told the hands to start checking the outbuilding latches and the corral gates. The storm hit on a Saturday night. Nell woke when the first lightning came, which was also when the sound hit. Not thunder exactly, but a pressure wave, the kind that rattled the bunkhouse walls and made the nail in her wall vibrate. She was up and dressed before the second strike, because she knew what lightning near horses meant, and she wasn't willing to find out from a distance. She was halfway across the yard when the rain started. Not gradually. All at once, the way Texas rain comes. A full wall of it descending without any courtesy of buildup. She was soaked before she covered 30 feet. She couldn't see more than 20 yards in any direction. The lightning was coming in pulses now, and each flash lit up the ranch in that flat, colorless way that made everything look like a photograph of itself. She could hear the horses before she reached the corrals. The sound that horses make when they're panicking is one of those sounds that doesn't leave you. High and continuous and carrying a kind of anguish that doesn't require translation. She got to the main corral fence and could see shapes moving fast in the dark intervals between lightning, and she counted them and realized with a cold drop in her stomach that one of the mares, the young chestnut, barely 4 years old, who was still figuring out how to be in her own skin, was pressed against the far fence rail with nowhere to go and no sense in her to find it. She went over the fence. She shouldn't have. She knew it even as she did it. Going into a corral with panicked horses in a lightning storm was the kind of decision that could get you killed in ways that were not interesting or noble. But the mare was going to break her own leg or go through the fence, and both outcomes were bad enough that she moved before she finished thinking about it. She was halfway across the corral when another lightning strike hit something close. Close enough that she felt it in her teeth, close enough that the thunder and the flash were simultaneous, and the mare exploded sideways. Nell hit the mud going down, felt her shoulder take the impact, and got her arms over her head because that was all there was time to do. The hooves missed her by a distance she would never be able to accurately estimate because she had her eyes closed. Then someone had her arm and was pulling her up, and she was on her feet before she fully understood she'd been lifted, and Moss Hollister was there with rain running off him in sheets, and his grip on her arm was hard enough to bruise. "What are you doing?" he said. His voice had to compete with the storm, and it was still the loudest thing she'd heard. "Getting her off the fence," she said. Her shoulder was burning. "You could have been killed. She was going to I don't care what she was going to do." He hadn't let go of her arm. "Do you understand me? That is not a situation you go into alone." She looked at him. The lightning flashed, and in that half second of white light she could see his face clearly. And what was on it wasn't anger, or not only anger. It was something underneath the anger, the thing that comes when you've seen something happen that you weren't able to prevent and you're still running on the fear of it. She said, "I'm all right." He looked at her for a long second. Then he said, "I know that," and released her arm. They worked the corrals together for the next hour. Other men arrived, Tommy, then Reuben, eventually most of the crew, and the whole ranch was organized into the controlled chaos of securing animals in a bad storm, which is essentially organized noise and mud, and everyone being slightly afraid but too busy to fully commit to it. She worked alongside Moss for most of it, the two of them falling into a functional rhythm without needing to discuss it much, her knowing which horse needed what, and him having the strength and the ground knowledge to execute it. By the time the storm broke, sometime around 3 in the morning, the rain easing first, then the lightning becoming distant, then the silence coming in like something earned. They were both exhausted and coated in mud from the knees down and standing in the middle of the main corral taking stock. All horses accounted for. The chestnut mare had a scrape along her flank, but nothing serious. 2 fence rails down on the east side. A latch blown off one of the outbuilding doors. It could have been much worse. Nell was checking the mare's scrape by lantern light when Moss stopped beside her. She could feel him there without looking up. His breathing had come back to normal. The urgency was out of the night now, replaced by that particular exhausted calm that comes after a crisis that ended better than it might have. "Your shoulder," he said. She'd forgotten about it. She rotated it experimentally and winced. "It's fine. It's fine. You went down hard. I've gone down harder." She finished with the mare, passed her hand over the scrape one more time to make sure she wasn't missing anything. "She'll be all right." "I know she will." A pause. "Nell." She looked up at him. He was close, closer than he usually stood, because the lantern light created a small circle, and they were both inside it, and there was nowhere else sensible to be. His face was half in shadow and half in the warm yellow of the lamp, and he looked tired in the specific way of a man who has been holding himself at a certain tension for a very long time. "Earlier," he said, "when I grabbed your arm, I didn't mean to." "You didn't hurt me," she said. "That's not what I'm saying." She waited. He looked away, then back. "I don't know what I'm saying," he said, with the honesty of a man who has given up, for the moment, on being careful. She looked at him for a second that was slightly longer than it needed to be. Then she picked up the lantern and said, "Get some sleep," and walked back to the bunkhouse. She did not sleep. She lay on the crooked mattress and stared at the ceiling and listened to the last rain coming off the eaves, and felt her shoulder pulse, and thought about very little specifically, which was her method when there was too much to think about directly. In the morning, everything looked different the way things always do after a storm. Cleaner and somehow more itself, the colors more present, the distances more honest. She was at the corrals at her usual time, checking on horses with the same early morning routine she'd established over the past weeks, and the ranch around her was moving through the post-storm cleanup without drama, because people who work land are accustomed to being hit by weather and getting back up, and there is something in that rhythm that has its own comfort. What was different was the men. She didn't notice it immediately. She was too focused on the morning work. But by mid-morning, it was undeniable. The small courtesies, the way conversations didn't stop when she approached, the way Reuben handed her a length of fence wire without being asked because he could see she needed it, the way even Cord, who had always been carefully indifferent to her, held a gate without her having to ask. They had seen her in the corral during the storm. They had seen her go in alone, and they had seen Moss pull her out, and they had seen both of those things for what they were. She understood. Respect on a working ranch was not given, it was witnessed. You had to do the thing in front of people, and the thing had to be real, and they had to decide on their own that it was worth respecting. She had been doing things for 8 weeks, and some of it had been noticed, but something about the storm had crystallized it in a way that all the tack cleaning and horsework hadn't. She would have preferred to earn it without almost getting flattened by a 4-year-old chestnut, but she didn't get to choose the circumstances. Jed noticed the change. She watched him notice it over the course of that day, watched his face cycle through something more complicated than anger, more like a man watching an argument he thought he was winning suddenly shift against him, recalculating, searching for the new angle. He was not stupid. She had never made the mistake of thinking he was stupid. By mid-afternoon, he had found the angle. She was in the main barn brushing mud off a saddle when she heard him talking to Cord near the back entrance. She wasn't hiding. She was just on the other side of a stall wall, and they hadn't come far enough in to see her. She kept brushing. Woman who shows up with nothing, and suddenly she's running the corrals and having private conversations with Moss every evening, Jed was saying, and everyone acts like that's natural. She worked hard, Cord said. He sounded uncertain. She positioned herself, Jed said. There's a difference. She's using those horses. She knows exactly what she's doing. She did save Obsidian, Cord said, more uncertainly. She was in the right place at the right time, Jed said, with the specific tone of someone constructing a simpler story over a more complex truth. Anyone could have walked that horse. And last night, going into that corral alone? That wasn't bravery, Cord. That was a performance. She wanted Moss to come in after her. A silence. You really think... I think a woman with nothing to her name and nowhere to go is going to do what she needs to do to secure a position, Jed said. And I think we all need to be very clear-eyed about that. She stopped brushing. Her first instinct was to walk around the stall wall and say everything that was in her mind directly to Jed Calloway's face. And she identified this instinct clearly and held it completely still because acting on it was exactly what he'd want. A confrontation, a loss of composure, something he could take to Moss framed as her inability to stay in her place. She kept brushing. She listened to them move on, their voices fading toward the back of the barn. She finished the saddle. She hung it properly. She walked out the front entrance and went about the rest of her afternoon with the focused deliberateness of someone who is using every available unit of concentration to keep moving forward rather than going back. Tommy found her near the water trough at dusk. I need to tell you something, he said, which was how Tommy always began things he was uncomfortable saying. Tell me, she said. Jed's been talking to some of the men. Not Reuben. Reuben won't have it. But Cord and some of the newer hands. Saying things about you. I know, she said. Tommy's forehead furrowed. You know? I heard him this afternoon. Then you know what he's saying. That I'm positioning myself. That last night was a performance. She kept her voice flat. That I'm after something I haven't earned. Tommy chewed the inside of his cheek, which he did when he was working up to saying something. You should tell Mr. Hollister. And say what? That Jed has opinions about me? He's always had opinions about me. That's not news. It's different now. He's trying to... Tommy. She looked at him directly. What exactly would you like me to tell him? That his foreman of 14 years is spreading rumors about me? Moss is going to hear that as a woman trying to undercut a man who was here long before she was. Tommy was quiet. I know, she said. I know it's not fair. Then what do you do? She thought about her father, about the patience he'd had with difficult horses, the long view approach, not fighting the resistance directly, but working around it, waiting for the moment when the animal's own nature revealed the path through. I keep doing my job, she said. Better than anyone else would do it. And I wait. Wait for what? She looked out at the pasture where Obsidian was moving in the last of the evening light with the easy confidence of a horse who had forgotten, or maybe just set aside, the things that used to terrify him. For Jed to make a mistake, she said, because that's what people do when they're angry. They make mistakes. She was right about that. She just couldn't have guessed what the mistake would look like, or what it would cost her before the truth came out. The rumors spread through the town of Redemption faster than they spread through the ranch, because towns move on gossip the way a fire moves on dry grass, opportunistically and without mercy. She heard about it from the Reverend's wife when she went into town for supplies at the end of October. The woman met her at the general store with the strained expression of someone delivering news they've been putting off. People are talking, dear, she said, quietly, as though the conversation itself was something to be concealed. Nell set her list on the counter. People were talking when I arrived with nothing and nowhere to go. What are they saying now? The Reverend's wife looked pained. That you've made yourself indispensable to Moss Hollister. In ways that aren't, that is to say, people are wondering about the nature of, they think I'm his mistress, Nell said. I don't use that word. But that's what they think. The woman's silence confirmed it. Nell bought her supplies and walked out. She stood in the street for a moment with her boxes and her list and the afternoon sun and thought about what it meant that a woman who had worked every single day of her life without asking for anything she hadn't earned could be standing in a street in a town where nobody knew her and having her character assassinated by rumors she couldn't trace to their source but could make a very good guess about. She thought about Jed Calloway and his 14 years and his clear lines and his vision of how things should run. She thought about what it would feel like to prove him wrong so completely that the correction would outlast the damage. She drove back to the ranch with her supplies and her thoughts, And she kept both to herself because she was not in a position to act yet, and she knew it. And the worst thing you could do in a position like that was act before you were ready. But she was getting ready. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known from inside the daily work of surviving Jed's management of her reputation, was that Jed had already moved past rumors. He had made a decision, the kind that can't be walked back, the kind that reveals what a man actually is when he's convinced himself that his reasons are good enough. She would find out what that decision was very soon. What it would cost her would be nearly everything she had built. And it would start, as so many things on this ranch seemed to, with obsidian. The night it happened, she was asleep. She had worked a long day, 11 hours, starting before the breakfast bell and ending after the dinner dishes, because one of the younger ranch hands had twisted his knee badly, and she'd taken on his afternoon rounds in addition to her own. She had fallen asleep without meaning to, still in her work clothes, the lantern burning down to almost nothing. She didn't hear the footsteps outside. She didn't hear the creak of the pasture gate. She didn't hear anything until morning, when Tommy's voice outside her window was too loud and too urgent to be part of a dream. "Nell!" His fist on the door. "Nell, wake up. He's gone." She was on her feet before she fully understood the words. She opened the door. Tommy's face was white under his permanent sunburn. "Obsidian," he said. "He's not in the pasture. Gates standing open." The ground seemed to shift slightly under her feet. Not from fear exactly, but from the specific cold clarity of understanding that something has happened that changes things, and that you are already behind, and that the time for being behind is very short. "How long?" she said. "Nobody knows. He was there at last check last night." She was already moving. The pasture gate stood open exactly as Tommy had described. She looked at the latch. It was not broken. It was not faulty. It had been opened and left open, and the specific way it was positioned, swung fully out rather than simply unlatched, told her something that she registered but couldn't yet afford to examine. She was on her knees looking at the ground for tracks when she heard Jed's voice behind her. "Find anything?" he said. She turned around. He was standing with 3 men behind him, his expression carefully arranged to convey concern. His hands were in his pockets. His boots were clean. His boots were clean. It had rained yesterday evening, not heavily, but enough. Everyone else on the ranch, everyone who'd been doing the morning chores, had mud on their boots. She looked at his boots and she felt something very cold move through her that was not a feeling she could name quickly. "Where were you last night?" she said. His expression shifted slightly, barely perceptibly. "Sleeping, same as everyone else." "Someone opened that gate," she said, "from outside." "Someone was careless with that gate," he said. "That's what I see." He looked at her steadily. "The question is who had access to that pasture last night?" "The men behind him." She looked at their faces. Some uncertain, some already moved by the story they were being told before it was fully spoken. "I was in my room all night," she said. "Were you?" Jed said. It was 2 words, just 2 words. But the way he said them was the entire structure of the accusation, complete and already standing. She looked at him for a long second, and she understood exactly what was happening, and she understood that she had no way to disprove it quickly enough to stop it, and she felt in that moment the particular helplessness of a person who has played by the rules and is watching someone else win anyway. "Find the horse," she said. She kept her voice completely even. "We can talk about the rest later, but find the horse first." She walked to the barn, saddled a horse, and rode out before Jed could organize any alternative. She rode in the direction a frightened horse would run, not toward town, not toward open flatland where everything was exposed, but toward the broken terrain to the north, where the scrubland thickened and there were draws and cuts in the land that a horse might head for out of some instinct for cover. She knew Obsidian. She had been learning him for 2 months. She knew how he moved, what he was drawn to, what scared him. She rode fast where the ground allowed it, and slow where she had to read tracks, and she did not let herself think about what was happening back at the ranch because there was nothing she could do about it from here. She was 4 miles out when she heard him. Not a whinny. A different sound, lower and more desperate, the sound of an animal that is hurt and pinned and trying to communicate the only way it has. The horse toward it and came over a low rise into a narrow ravine, and there he was. Obsidian had gone into the ravine in the dark and run into the remnants of an old fence, barbed wire, half buried in the scrub, invisible until you were already in it. He was tangled in two strands, one around his right foreleg and one that had caught across his chest, and he had been pulling against it long enough that both cuts were bad. He was shaking. He was exhausted. His eyes had that terrible flat quality of an animal that has been in pain and fear long enough to be somewhere past the acute stage and into something more worrying. She got off her horse. "I'm here," she said. "I've got you. I'm right here." She moved slowly, talking constantly, reaching him before he could react in a way that made things worse. She got her hands on his head, on his face, felt him lean into her with a weight that was not horse weight, but something more fundamental. "I know," she said. "I know. I'm going to get you out." The wire was old and rusted and tangled in ways that required patience she had to manufacture from somewhere, because her hands were shaking slightly, and she needed them not to. She worked the strand at his foreleg first, because it was pulling the tightest and doing the most damage, using the tool from her saddlebag and talking the whole time, keeping her voice at the same pitch and pace regardless of what her insides were doing. It took 40 minutes. She was bleeding from 3 places on her hands and arms where the wire had caught her when Obsidian stepped free of the last strand. He stood for a moment without moving, like he was checking whether freedom was real, and then he put his face against her shoulder and breathed. She stood there with him for a minute she couldn't afford but couldn't skip. Then she heard hoofbeats on the rise above, and Moss Hollister came over the edge of the ravine and stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the horse. He looked at the wire and the blood on her hands, and the 40 minutes of work visible in the scene around them. He looked at her face, which she knew was not currently showing everything she was feeling, because she had gotten very good at that, but was probably showing more than she intended. He got off his horse. He didn't say anything immediately. He walked down into the ravine and stood close enough that she could see the expression on his face, and what was on it was something she hadn't seen from him before. Not the careful measuring look, not the near smile, not the closed professional mask. Something more exposed than all of those. "A boy on the ranch saw Jed near the pasture last night," Moss said. His voice was quiet and level in the way of someone keeping it that way on purpose. "A young hand, 15 years old. He was up late with a stomachache, and he saw Jed walking from that direction." She held very still. "He was afraid to say anything," Moss said. "He told Tommy this morning, and Tommy came to me." The ravine was very quiet except for Obsidian breathing and the distant sound of wind through the scrub brush. "Jed told the crew it was your carelessness," she said. "I know what Jed told the crew." "And you?" She stopped. She wasn't sure what she'd been going to say. "I hesitated," Moss said. "I want to be honest with you. My first instinct was, I've known Jed 14 years and I've known you 2 months, and I hesitated." He looked at her directly, and there was no flinching in it. "That was wrong. I should not have hesitated for 1 second. She looked at him. "You came out here alone," he said, "after being accused, after I didn't defend you. You came out here anyway and found him and got him free." "I wasn't doing it to prove anything," she said. "I was doing it because he needed help." "I know that," Moss said. "That's exactly why I was wrong." She looked at Obsidian, who was beginning to settle now, his breathing slowing, the trembling going out of his legs. She thought about everything she'd built in 8 weeks at the cost of everything she'd had to give. She thought about her trunk in the mud on the first morning and Jed's voice carrying across the yard. "Get out. You got no business being here. Never did." She thought about what it meant that she was still here. "He needs to be looked at by the vet," she said. "The cuts are going to need cleaning properly. The one on his foreleg is deeper than it looks." "I'll send Tommy for Doc Weller," Moss said. "All right," she said. She picked up the lead rope and started walking Obsidian slowly toward the rise, watching his movement, checking the leg. He was favoring it, but he was walking. He was going to be all right. She knew that with the same certainty, she knew most things about this horse. Not perfectly, not without possibility of being wrong, but as solidly as the ground under her feet. Moss walked beside her, and they went up the rise and out of the ravine and back toward the ranch in the morning light. And neither of them said anything else, because there wasn't anything else that needed saying yet. Behind them, the old wire fence lay in the scrub brush where she'd cut it free, and the blood on her hands was already drying in the warm air. And Obsidian walked between them with the careful dignity of an animal that has been through something hard and come out the other side still standing. They came back to the ranch at a walk, the 3 of them, Nell, Moss, and Obsidian, moving between them on the lead rope. And the yard was quiet, in the way that yards go quiet
when people are watching from places they don't want to be seen watching from. She felt it before she saw it. The particular stillness of a place where something is about to happen or has already happened, and nobody is sure which. Jed was standing at the entrance to the main barn. He had positioned himself there with the unconscious instinct of a man who understands territorial space, who had spent 14 years being the first thing you encountered when you came back to the center of this ranch. He watched them come across the yard with an expression that she had learned to read over these past weeks. The controlled surface with the calculation underneath, like ice over moving water. For a moment, nobody spoke. Obsidian's hooves on the packed dirt were the only sound. Then Jed looked at Moss. "You found him." "Nell found him," Moss said. 4 miles north, tangled in old fence wire. Jed's eyes moved to her briefly. "Glad he's all right." It was the right thing to say. It was exactly the right thing to say, delivered with exactly the right amount of relieved concern, and it was so precisely calibrated that she almost admired it even as it made her stomach turn. "I want to talk to you," Moss said to Jed, "after the horse is seen to." "Of course," Jed said. He stepped aside from the barn entrance. She led Obsidian inside, and behind her she could feel the yard exhaling, the hidden watchers allowing themselves to breathe again. The postponed thing still postponed, but now with a time attached to it. Tommy materialized at her elbow inside the barn, took the lead rope without being asked, and started talking to the horse in the low, murmuring way he'd learned from watching her do it. "Doc Weller's been sent for," Tommy said quietly. "Reuben rode out 20 minutes ago." "Good." She went to the tack room and got what she needed to start cleaning the wire cuts while they waited. Clean rags. The carbolic solution she'd organized into the medicine chest in her second week because it had been sitting in a corner of the storage room unlabeled and getting dusty. She came back and started working on the foreleg wound, kneeling in the straw, Obsidian standing steadily above her. Tommy held the rope and watched her hands. "What's going to happen?" he said, not asking about the horse. "I don't know," she said. Moss looked angry. "Moss is angry." "At Jed?" She pressed a clean cloth against the cut and held it. "At himself, partly. That's my read. People who are only angry at someone else are usually easier to handle than people who are also angry at themselves." Tommy thought about this. "Is that good or bad?" "For Jed? Bad." She checked the wound again. "For everyone else?" "I think good. I hope good." She kept working. The cut was deep enough that it was going to need more attention than she could give it, but the bleeding had largely stopped and the horse's leg wasn't swelling in any alarming way, which meant the damage was to the surface and not to anything structural underneath. She was not naive enough to be certain of that. She had seen injuries that looked manageable become serious within hours, but the signs she knew to look for were absent, and she was trying to make reasonable assessments rather than catastrophic ones. Obsidian stood through the whole thing with the patience of an animal that had learned somewhere in the past months that being handled by this particular person meant things got better rather than worse. That trust had been built one quiet evening at a time. And looking at it now, in this barn, with everything still uncertain, and Jed Calloway 20 yards away having a conversation with the only person on this property who had the authority to change anything. She felt the weight of what it had cost her to build it, and what it would cost her to lose it. She was not going to let herself lose it. Moss came into the barn 40 minutes later. His face was composed in the way of someone who has finished a difficult conversation and is still carrying the temperature of it. He stopped near Obsidian's head, ran his hand along the horse's jaw the way she'd seen him do before. Not a greeting exactly, more like checking that something important was still there. "Doc Weller should be here within the hour," he said. "The foreleg cut's going to need stitching," she said. "One of the chest scrapes might too, depending on what he says." Moss nodded. He was quiet for a moment that had more inside it than she knew how to address directly. "I spoke with the boy," he said finally. "Young Caleb. He's 15. He's been here 8 months. He was awake last night because he'd eaten something bad at dinner, and he was outside getting some air, and he saw Jed walking from the north pasture at midnight. He paused. He didn't want to say anything because Jed hired him, and he was afraid. She kept her hands moving. "And Jed?" Moss's jaw tightened slightly. "Jed said the boy was mistaken, said he was in his bunk all night, and that the boy was half asleep and imagining things." A beat. "Then I told him what the boys described, specific things,
The hat Jed was wearing. The way he walks. That particular hitch in his left stride that he's had since a horse fell on him 6 years ago. The direction he came from. Moss stopped. Jed stopped talking after that. She looked up at him. He didn't confess, Moss said. I want to be clear about that. He didn't say yes. I opened the gate. What he did was go quiet in the way of a man who has run out of the story he was telling and doesn't have another one ready. That's enough, she said. It's enough for me, Moss said. Whether it's enough for... He stopped. I let it go too far. I want to say that plainly. The way things were allowed to go for too long, the way you were treated. You gave me work when nobody else in this county would, she said. You listened when it mattered. You weren't perfect about it, but you tried. She looked at him steadily. Neither am I. Perfect, I mean. He held her gaze. I should have trusted what I saw earlier. Yes, she said. You should have. She wasn't going to give him the easy version. He'd asked for honesty, and she respected him enough to give it. But I also understand why you didn't. Jed's been here 14 years. I showed up with a trunk and a dead man's address. Those aren't equal starting positions. They should be, he said. On this ranch, a person's word should be worth what they've earned, not how long they've been around. That's a good principle, she said. It's also easier to hold when you're not the one being tested on it. He looked at her for a moment. Then something moved through his expression that was close to a rueful acknowledgement, the face of a man who has been given an honest assessment and finds it accurate and uncomfortable. Jed is leaving the ranch, he said. She had expected it, but still felt the weight of the words when they came. Not relief exactly, something more complicated. When? She said. He has until end of week to collect his things. I've paid him what's owed. He knows the terms. Moss paused. He did not take it quietly. No, she said. I didn't imagine he would. He said several things about you and about my judgment that I'm not going to repeat because they don't deserve repeating. He said them to me in private, and they'll stay there. His voice had a flatness to it now that she recognized as the residue of a hard conversation, the way a room sounds after a fight, different in quality from before, the air not quite the same. She absorbed this. She had known, at some level, since she'd looked at Jed's clean boots that morning in the pasture, that this was where it was going. Knowing didn't make it simple. There are men on this crew who are loyal to him, she said. I know. That's not going to resolve itself when he walks out the gate. I know that too. Moss looked at her directly. I'm going to need help managing the transition. Somebody who understands the horses and the men well enough to help me keep this operation steady while things shift. She recognized what he was offering before he finished the sentence. She was careful not to react to it immediately because her first reaction was always the one she trusted least. What are you asking? She said. I'm asking if you'll step into a different role here. Not officially. Not yet. Not until the dust settles, and it makes sense to talk about it formally, but practically. Working alongside me on the horse management and the daily operations. Reuben won't like that, she said. Reuben's going to do what makes sense for the ranch, Moss said. He's a fair man underneath the loyalty. I think he's already questioning more than he's showing. She thought about Reuben handing her the fence wire, the small unconscious courtesies of the morning after the storm. Maybe, she said. Cord's going to be more difficult, Moss said. Cord follows whoever seems most certain, she said. He's not mean-spirited, he's just looking for a clear line to follow. If the line shifts, he'll shift with it eventually. Moss nodded slowly. You've been watching my crew. I've been surviving your crew, she said. Watching was part of that. A silence. Outside the barn, the ranch sounds continued. Horses in the far pasture, a door somewhere, one of the men calling to another across the yard. The ordinary sound of a place that didn't know yet how much had changed this morning or was still deciding whether to believe it. All right, she said. All right, you'll do it? All right, I'll think about it seriously and tell you by tonight. He almost smiled. That's reasonable. I have conditions, she said. Tell me. The boy, Caleb, he's not to face anything from the men for coming forward. If I hear of anyone giving him trouble over it, I need to know you'll deal with it directly. Done, Moss said without hesitating. And I keep my role with the horses regardless of what else happens. Nobody tells me when I can and can't be at that fence. Done. And if I'm working alongside you on operations, I need to be able to speak directly, not filtered through someone else's interpretation of what I said or what I meant. He looked at her. Have I ever filtered you? She thought about it honestly. No, she said. You haven't. Then that condition's already met, he said. Doc Weller arrived 40 minutes later in a cloud of dust from a horse that had been pushed hard from town. He was a compact man in his 60s with the no-ceremony manner of someone who had seen too many emergencies to treat any of them as theater. He examined Obsidian thoroughly, the foreleg, the chest, two smaller cuts that Nell had initially assessed as minor, and confirmed her read on all of it. The foreleg needed 4 stitches. The chest scrape needed cleaning and monitoring but not stitching. The others were surface damage, would heal clean. He stitched the foreleg with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times, talked through the aftercare instructions in a tone that assumed Nell would be the one implementing them, which she would, and charged a fee that was approximately twice what a town call would have cost because of the ride-out. Moss paid it. Before Doc Weller left, he stopped at the barn door and looked at the work Nell had done in the field. The cleaned wounds, the properly applied pressure bandaging that had controlled the bleeding effectively enough that the stitching had been straightforward. You trained under your father, he said. It was not quite a question. Starting when I was about 8, she said. He trained you well. He paused. You ever think about going into this professionally? She looked at him. I'm a woman. I noticed, he said dryly. I'm asking if you've thought about it. I've thought about a lot of things, she said. He nodded once, replaced his hat, and walked out. She stood in the barn doorway, watching him ride back toward town, and felt something in that exchange she couldn't fully name. Not hope exactly, but the sense of a door she hadn't known existed being briefly visible before it closed again. The afternoon was long in the way that afternoons are long when a great deal has happened, and there is nothing to do but let the hours move at their own pace while you wait for the dust to settle or not settle. Jed collected things from the foreman's quarters. She didn't see him do it. She stayed with the horses, which was where she needed to be. But she heard about it in pieces through the afternoon. He packed in under 2 hours, which suggested he had been, at some level, prepared for this possibility, or at least keeping his things in a state that didn't require much organizing to leave. 3 of the men, Cord among them, spent the better part of the afternoon visibly not sure where to put themselves. She saw them at the far end of the yard, talking in the tight cluster of people having a conversation they don't want overheard. She didn't approach. She went about her business and let them have their conversation, because forcing the issue was exactly the wrong move, and she'd spent too many weeks learning that lesson to ignore it now. Reuben came to the barn at mid-afternoon. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke, and she recognized the body language of a man who has prepared what he wanted to say and is now second-guessing the preparation. I owe you an apology, he said. She looked up from the feed calculation she was working on. For what specifically? He blinked. He'd been expecting her to wave it off, she could tell. For listening to Jed when I should have been making my own judgments. You were loyal to someone you'd known for 14 years, she said. That's not a character flaw. It let things go further than they should have. She set the feed chart down. Reuben, I'm not going to tell you it didn't affect me because it did. But I also understand how it happened. What I need to know is whether it's over. He held her gaze. He was about 50, she estimated, with the weathered solidity of a man who had done outdoor work his whole life, and had no particular complaints about it. He had a good face. Honest, she thought, genuinely honest, the kind that bad behavior sat uncomfortably on. It's over, he said. Then we start from here, she said. That's good enough for me. He nodded once, turned to go. Reuben. He stopped. The south fence posts. I mentioned them to Moss 3 weeks ago, and a crew got to them, but I noticed yesterday that the section 30 yards east of where they worked has the same problem developing. It needs to be on next week's list. He looked at her for a moment. Then he took a small notebook from his shirt pocket and wrote something in it. I'll put it on the list, he said. He left. She went back to the feed calculations. Tommy appeared at her shoulder approximately 4 minutes later with the energy of a young man who has been holding in a reaction for hours and can no longer contain it. Reuben just apologized to you, he said. He did. In 14 years, I have never once heard Reuben Voss apologize to anyone for anything. Then I'm flattered, she said. Nell. He sat down on a hay bale. Are
Are you all right? With everything that's happened today, are you actually all right? She stopped and considered the question honestly, which was the courtesy he deserved for asking it genuinely. Her hand still had cuts from the wire. Her shoulder from the storm hadn't fully healed, and the morning's work had reminded it. She was tired from a night of not sleeping and a morning of hard riding and difficult hours, and underneath the tiredness there was something else, a kind of braced quality, like a person who has been hit enough times that they've stopped fully relaxing between blows. "I've been better," she said. "I've also been considerably worse. I'll take today." He looked at her with the earnest concern of someone who is 20 and hasn't yet learned to be strategic about their feelings. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner about what Jed was saying to the men. I kept thinking it would stop." "It's all right." "It's not, but Tommy." She looked at him. "You told Moss about Caleb this morning. That mattered. That's what needed to happen." He was quiet for a moment. He was scared. Caleb was. "He's just a kid." "I know." She thought about a 15-year-old boy with a stomach ache and what it had taken for him to tell the truth. When telling it was frightening. "He did a brave thing." "Are you going to—" Tommy started. "I mean, are you staying after all this? Or—" "I'm staying," she said. She said it without drama, the way you say things that are simply true. Jed left the ranch before sundown. She heard the wagon and looked out from the barn door. Not to watch, not deliberately, but the sound was there and she was near the door and she looked. I was on the seat of a flatbed with his boxes loaded in the back and Cord standing 20 feet away looking at the ground. The other men who had been closest to him, 2 or 3 of them, were not visible, which meant they'd said whatever they needed to say in private or hadn't said it at all. Jed drove out the gate without looking back. She turned around and went back to work. But Cord was still standing in the yard when she came out 20 minutes later, and he was standing in the specific way of a man who has run out of directions to face. She almost walked past him. She got 3 steps away and then stopped because she thought about what she'd said to Tommy about him. He follows whoever seems most certain, and thought about what it cost a person to pick a side and have it removed from under them without warning. She turned back. "There's a bay gelding in the east pasture," she said. "The one with the blaze. I've been watching him this week and I think he's got something developing in his left hock. I could use a second opinion on the movement before I bring it to Moss." Cord looked up at her. His expression went through something complicated and ended somewhere she couldn't fully read. "I'll take a look," he said, after a moment. They walked to the east pasture together, not talking much, and she watched the gelding move and asked Cord what he saw, and he described what she'd already identified with enough accuracy to confirm that his eye was good and his knowledge was genuine, even if his judgment of people needed some developing. She told him so. The second part. "My judgment of people," he repeated, like he was checking whether he'd heard it right. "You're good with horses," she said. "You read them well. You're less good with reading people, but that's a thing that improves with practice if you're willing to do the practice." He looked at her. You're not angry." "I'm not angry," she said honestly, "but I'm also not interested in spending the next 6 months on it. This ranch needs to work. That means the people on it need to work. Does that include you?" A long pause. "Yeah," he said. "It does." "Good," she said. "Then let's talk about this gelding." They talked about the gelding for 20 minutes, and she was fairly sure by the end of it that it was a minor thing that would resolve with a change in how he was being worked. And Cord agreed, and they walked back to the main yard without ceremony and went about their separate business. She reported to Moss after dinner. He was on the porch of the main house, a place she had been exactly once since arriving, when he'd called her in to ask about a feed order, and which she had noticed then and noticed again now as a place that was large and well-built, and profoundly empty feeling in the way of spaces that had been designed for more people than currently occupied them. He was sitting in one of the porch chairs with a cup of coffee that was probably cold and a ledger that was probably not what he was actually thinking about. "Your answer?" he said when she came up the steps. "My answer is yes," she said. "With the conditions I named." He nodded. He didn't look surprised. "I thought you'd come around to it." "I thought about it for 6 hours," she said. "That's not coming around. That's making a decision." He looked at her. "Fair enough." She sat in the other chair without being invited, which she decided was appropriate given what they were discussing.
I didn't react to it as anything unusual. Cord came around today, she said. I heard. Some of the other men are going to need time. I'd ask you not to push them. I wasn't planning to push them. Good. She looked out at the yard, which was settling into its evening configuration, the last light off the barn roofline, the horses moving slowly in the near pasture, the gradual quiet of a working place winding down. Reuben's going to be fine. Reuben's always fine, Moss said. He's the most consistently fair person I've ever employed and also the most stubborn, and eventually those two qualities point in the same direction. She thought that was an accurate description. Caleb, she said. I talked to him this afternoon, Moss said. He's all right. Scared, but all right. I told him what he did took real courage. Good. I also gave him a raise, Moss said, which might be unusual but felt right. She looked at him. He was looking at the yard. In the evening light, he was easier to see clearly than he usually was, maybe because he was sitting still rather than always in motion, always purposeful. He looked like a man who had been carrying something for a long time and was starting to notice the weight. You said his wife picked Obsidian's dam, she said. She didn't know exactly why she said it. It came out. He was quiet for a moment. She did. She said the mare had eyes that understood things. I thought that was a strange way to evaluate a horse. He paused. I think she was right, though. Clara, Nell said. Clara, he said. He said it the same careful way he always said it, like a thing he'd said many times and had made his peace with but not finished grieving. You kept the ranch going, she said. After. I didn't know what else to do. He looked at his coffee cup. Working is easy. Working, you don't have to think past the next thing that needs doing. She understood that completely. She had been doing the same thing, in different circumstances, for most of her adult life. I stopped trusting my own judgment, he said. I want to be honest with what happened with Jed this morning. I stopped trusting it a while back, after she died. The things I was certain of and turned out not to be. I started relying on what had already been established, what was already in place. 14 years of Jed Calloway running this operation, that felt like solid ground. It was solid ground, she said, in most respects. In most, he agreed. Not all. She looked at the yard. Obsidian was visible from here, moving slowly at the edge of the near pasture. The stitched foreleg carried carefully, but not badly. He was already doing better than she'd feared this morning. I'm sorry, Moss said, for the hesitation. I want to say it again outside of the barn because I meant it, and it belongs somewhere more formal than that. I heard you the first time, she said, and I accepted it. You could have left, he said, this morning, after everything. You could have gone back to your room and packed your trunk and been on the road before noon. She thought about the trunk in the mud on her first morning, the specific weight of having nowhere to go. I could have, she said. Why didn't you? She considered the question honestly because he was asking it honestly. Partly because of Obsidian, she said. I wasn't going to leave him out there. And the other part? She looked at the ranch. All of it. The barn, the corrals, the bunkhouse, the pastures going dark at the edges where the evening was coming in. The whole large, complicated working reality of this place that had given her the hardest weeks of her adult life. And also, in some way she was still understanding, given her something she hadn't been able to name when she arrived. I've been looking for something settled for a long time, she said. I got close to it once and it didn't work out. I'm not ready to stop looking just because someone made things difficult. She paused. Jed didn't drive me away. I don't let that kind of person drive me away. I decided that about myself a long time ago. Moss was quiet. Though I'll tell you, she said, and she heard her own voice go slightly less controlled on this than she'd intended. There were about 4 hours today when I wasn't sure I was going to manage it. He looked at her. Which 4 hours? The ones between when I heard about the gate and when I found him in the ravine, she said. Those were the worst 4 hours. Because of the horse? Because of the horse, she said. And because I knew what it looked like, and I knew I couldn't prove otherwise fast enough to stop it from doing damage. And because I'd worked very hard for 8 weeks, and I could feel it all going sideways, and there was nothing I could do except keep moving. He was listening with the particular quality of attention he had when something mattered to him, which she had noticed early and continued to notice.
You kept moving, he said. I did, she said. It's the only thing that's ever worked for me. He put his coffee cup down on the porch rail.
Looked at her in the way he'd looked at her in the ravine this morning. That open, unguarded quality that his face didn't usually allow itself. I'm glad you stayed, he said. It was a simple thing to say, and he said it simply, without anything extra in it, and that was exactly why it landed the way it did. Not like a performance of feeling, but like the actual thing. I'm glad I stayed too, she said. They sat on the porch for a while after that, not talking much, letting the evening come in around the ranch the way it always did. Slowly and without announcement, the sky going from rose to gray to the deep blue-black that meant another day was fully done. When she went back to the bunkhouse, she lay on the mattress, still crooked, still listing to the left. She'd given up expecting it to improve, and looked at the ceiling and let herself acknowledge, quietly and without drama, that something had shifted today. Not resolved, not finished. Things were going to remain complicated in the ways that any real situation was complicated when the people in it were complicated, which they were, but shifted. The spider in the corner had built something quite ambitious in the past few weeks. She noticed it in the lantern light, a structure that had expanded from the simple geometry of her first night into something considerably more elaborate, working outward from the original corner into the adjacent beam. She thought about obsidian in his pasture, the stitched foreleg and the chest scrape, and the particular courage of an animal that had been hurt and was healing. She thought about a 15-year-old boy with a stomachache who had told the truth when it was frightening. She thought about what Moss had said on the porch. Not the last thing, though, she thought about that too. She thought about working is easy. Working, you don't have to think past the next thing that needs doing. She had been doing that for so long she'd gotten very good at it. Maybe too good. Maybe good enough that she'd nearly missed the thing she'd actually been working toward. She turned over and closed her eyes. In the morning, there was work to do. There always was. And she was grateful for it. And also, for the first time in a long time, she was aware that the work itself was no longer the only thing she was doing here. That felt like something worth being careful with. She intended to be careful with it. Outside, the ranch settled into the deep quiet of a Texas night, the horses breathing in their pastures, the stars doing what stars do over flat country, spreading out across the dark in a density that was almost impossible to look at directly, the kind of sky that made a person feel very small and also, paradoxically, very located. She was somewhere. She was exactly where she was. And tomorrow she would get up and do the work and navigate the complications and watch Obsidian's leg improve and have difficult conversations with men who weren't sure yet what to make of her. And it would be hard, and she would do it anyway, because that was who she was and had always been, and she'd stopped apologizing for it approximately 3 months ago in a stagecoach coming through flat country very much like this. She slept. The first week after Jed left was the strangest week Nell had spent on the ranch, which was saying something given the competition. It wasn't that things fell apart. They didn't. The horses were fed, the fences were checked. The daily work of running a cattle and horse operation continued with the particular momentum that large working properties develop over years, a kind of institutional gravity that keeps moving even when the people inside it are uncertain. Reuben stepped into the operational gap with the competence of someone who had been doing the real work for a long time, regardless of who held the title. Tommy was everywhere he needed to be. Even Cord showed up consistently and did his job without drama, which was all she'd asked of him. What was strange was the silence where Jed had been. Not the literal silence. The ranch was never literally silent. There was always something making noise somewhere. A horse, a gate, a man calling across the yard. But the absence of that constant low-grade pressure she'd been operating under since her first morning. The awareness she'd maintained every day of where Jed was and what he was doing and what he might be building toward. It had been exhausting in a way she hadn't fully understood until the source of it was gone. The way you don't know how much a sound has been wearing on you until it stops. She caught herself, 3 days after he left, checking the yard before she walked across it. Old habit, already forming its own groove. She stopped in the middle of the yard and made herself not do it. Made herself just walk. It took more effort than it should have. Obsidian's foreleg was healing cleanly. Doc Weller came back at the end of the first week, examined the stitches, pronounced himself satisfied, and told her she could start light movement in another 10 days. She'd already been doing light movement, just hand walking, nothing that put real stress on the leg. And she mentioned this to the doctor, who looked at her and said he would have told her to do exactly that, and seemed mildly annoyed that she'd thought of it herself. "You should come work for me," he said, for the second time. "You said that before," she said. "I meant it before, too." He packed his bag. "I've been looking for someone who can handle the large animal calls that require real knowledge and real nerve. Most people have one or the other." She handed him back the instrument he'd left on the fence rail. "I have a job," she said. "You have several jobs," he said dryly. "What's one more?" He rode back to town and she stood in the November light watching him go and thinking about the version of herself who might have taken that offer in different circumstances, at a different time. It wasn't an uncomfortable thought. It was just a thought. One of those quiet recognitions of the roads you didn't take that doesn't require mourning, just acknowledging. Moss found her still at the fence. "What did Weller say?" he asked. 10 more days before real work. The healing is clean." He nodded. He leaned on the rail beside her, looking at obsidian in the pasture. "He offered you a job again." She glanced at him. "Heard that, did you?" "Sound carries out here." "He did," she said. I declined. Moss was quiet for a moment. Not the loaded kind of quiet, more the genuine kind, where a person is simply present and not performing anything. She'd gotten good at telling the difference with him. "I'd understand if you wanted to consider it," he said. "I don't," she said. "Not right now." He looked at her briefly. "Not right now leaves room." "Everything leaves room," she said. "That's not a bad thing." He considered this. "No," he said. "I suppose it isn't." They stood at the fence for a few minutes without talking, which was something that had become possible between them in a way it hadn't been earlier. The comfortable silence of two people who had been through enough together that they didn't need to fill all the space with words. She noticed it the way you notice something that has arrived without announcement and is simply there when you look for it. Cord came across the yard toward them with the rolling walk of someone who'd been in the saddle most of the morning. "The north section's clear," he said to Moss, then looked at Nell. "That bay gelding is moving better." "I changed how he's being worked," she said. "He needed more straight-line work, less of the tight circles." Cord nodded. He still didn't look entirely comfortable talking to her, but he looked like a man who had decided that discomfort wasn't a reason to stop trying. "Makes sense," he said. "I'll pass it along to the others." He went back to his work. Moss watched him go. "Cord's coming around," he said. Cord was never as far gone as he looked, she said. He just needed the clearer line to follow. "And you provided it." "I provided the same line I always have," she said, "just in circumstances where he could see it." The weeks moved forward the way November weeks do in Texas, with a gradually increasing cold that the landscape seemed to resist, the warmth holding in the afternoons and retreating only at night, the sky clear and high and blue in the way that made distances look smaller than they were. She worked, which was the thing she always did and always would do, but the work had a different quality now. Less survival, more building. The distinction mattered to her even if it didn't show from the outside. She formalized the horse management structure that she'd been running informally since Jed left, wrote it out in a simple system that Moss could follow, that Reuben could implement, that any new hand could learn without needing her to be present for every decision. It took her 2 evenings, and she was not confident in the spelling of everything, but she was confident in the content, and when she gave it to Moss, he read it at the kitchen table. She was there for this, having been asked in for coffee, which had started happening with enough regularity that it was no longer unusual, and read it with the focus of a man taking something seriously. "This is good," he said. He meant it. "Some of it's obvious," she said, "but obvious things don't get done consistently unless someone writes them down." "Where'd you learn that?" "From watching what happens when nobody does." He looked at her over the paper. "You should be running something," he said. Not to compliment her, just as an observation, the way you'd note that a particular horse was bred for speed, as a matter of fact. "I'm running something," she said. "More than this," he said. She drank her coffee. "Let's get this thing working properly first before we talk about more." He accepted that and went back to reading. The kitchen was warm. She was aware of that. The specific warmth of a room that had a fire in it and 2 people in it, and the smell of coffee and the sound of the wind outside against the windows. She was aware of it in the way you're aware of things you've been doing without, and then suddenly have The specific quality of a thing you didn't know you'd missed because you'd been careful not to think about it. She had been very careful for a very long time. She thought about that riding back to the bunkhouse later, about what it cost to be careful, about the things she'd kept at arm's length, not because she didn't want them, but because wanting things you couldn't count on seemed like a form of punishment she was inflicting on herself. Silas Croft's letters had been the first time in years she'd let herself want something specific enough to move toward. And it hadn't worked, and she'd ended up in redemption with 53 cents and a wedding dress. And somewhere in that experience, she had adjusted the want downward to something settled, something steady, something that couldn't be taken away because it was already humble enough not to attract that kind of loss. She had built that on this ranch. She had built it out of tack cleaning and floor scrubbing and early mornings and the long, slow, patient work of earning trust from a horse nobody else could reach. The question she had been avoiding, the one that had been sitting in the corner of her mind like the spider's web, more elaborate every time she looked at it, was whether she had built it only as far as she'd let herself, and whether that limit was wisdom or fear. She didn't answer the question that night, but she stopped avoiding it, which was a start. The trouble with redemption didn't announce itself cleanly either. It came in the form of a woman named Patricia Gable, the same Mrs. Gable who had looked at Nell like overripe fruit on her second day in town and told her there was no work available. She arrived at Hollister Ranch on a Tuesday in mid-November in a buggy driven by her husband, who looked like a man accustomed to being adjacent to his wife's decisions without being consulted about them. Nell was in the yard when they pulled up. She watched Mrs. Gable step down from the buggy with the careful elegance of a woman who had perfected the art of arriving somewhere, and she felt a mild internal brace, not quite dread, but the specific anticipatory alertness of someone who has been in the ring with this opponent before and knows the style. Mrs. Gable saw her. Something moved briefly across the woman's face. Then it was replaced with the warm social expression she was wearing for this visit. "Miss Harper," she said, "how good to see you looking so well." "Mrs. Gable," Nell said. "Mr. Gable." She nodded to the husband, who nodded back with the relieved expression of a man who has been acknowledged and no longer has to wonder if he will be. "We've come to call on Moss, on Mr. Hollister," Mrs. Gable said. "Is he about?" "I'll let him know you're here," Nell said. She found Moss in the barn going through the breeding records with Reuben. She told him who was in the yard. His expression did something complicated that he resolved into neutrality before he answered. "What do they want?" he said. She didn't say. "Social call, by the look of it." Moss looked at Reuben, who made a face that communicated both sympathy and the clear preference not to be included in whatever this was. Moss went out to the yard. Nell went back to what she'd been doing, which was sorting through the winter feed projections and identifying where they were going to be short if the cold came in harder than expected. She was 3/4 done with this when Tommy appeared. "Mrs. Gable keeps looking over here," he said. He'd positioned himself near the barn door with no particular purpose, which meant he was watching. "I'm aware," she said. "She's talking a lot, smiling a lot. Mr. Hollister is not smiling." "Tommy, I'm just describing what I see." "Go describe it somewhere else," she said. He went. 15 minutes later, he was back. "They're leaving," he said. "Mrs. Gable looked over here again right before she got in the buggy." "Is that all?" "Mr. Hollister is coming this way, and he looks, I don't know how to describe it, like he got handed something he didn't ask for." Moss came into the barn with exactly the expression Tommy had attempted to describe. He stood for a moment, then sat on the hay bale that had become his unofficial sitting place in the barn over the past weeks. She'd noticed this, the way he had started gravitating to this space in the way of someone who found it easier to think here than elsewhere. "Patricia Gable," he said, wanted to inform me that there is a great deal of talk in town." "About me," Nell said. She kept her voice even. "About you. About me. About the nature of things," as she put it. He looked at his hands. She framed it as concern. She said she'd always had great respect for this ranch and wanted me to know what was being said before it, her word, deteriorated. "Jed's work," Nell said. "Some of it predates Jed leaving," Moss said. "But yes, some of it is more recent." He looked up. She also mentioned that the woman who was hired as a domestic at this ranch was now apparently making operational decisions, and that certain people found that confusing. "Certain people," Nell said. "People who have nothing better to do than be confused about other people's ranches." he said, with a flatness that told her exactly what he thought of those people. She set the feed projections aside. Moss, what do you want to do about it? He looked at her. What I want to do about it, he said, and what makes sense to do about it. Those might be different things, and I want to have that conversation with you directly rather than making a decision I haven't thought through. She appreciated that. She told him so. What I want to do, he said, is ignore it entirely. Because what happens on this ranch is my concern, and this ranch is doing better than it's done in 2 years, and the only person I've seen Patricia Gable be kind to in my memory is people who had something she wanted, so her concern for my reputation. He stopped. But, she said. But you're the one who has to live in this county, he said. You're the one who walks into town and deals with those people. And I'm not going to make decisions about your reputation without asking you what you want. She sat with that for a moment. What she wanted was what she'd always wanted, to be assessed by what she did rather than by what people who hadn't done it decided she must be. She knew she was not going to get that from Mrs. Gable or from the people who shared Mrs. Gable's entertainments. She was not going to get it from the whispers that had started when she arrived with her trunk and her dead man's address and had never fully stopped. She knew the only way a woman in her position changed the story was by making the story too large to argue with, not by defending herself, by becoming undeniable. I think, she said, that the way to handle this is to keep doing what we're doing until it becomes obvious to anyone paying attention that their version of events doesn't match reality. That could take time, he said. Things that matter usually do, she said. He looked at her steadily. Then, and this was the thing she hadn't expected, the thing that caught her with her careful walls slightly down, he said, I'd like to give them less to speculate about, or more, depending on how they want to look at it. She waited. I'm not good at this, he said. I want to be honest about that before I say the next thing. I was married for 12 years, and I am aware that I was not always easy to be married to. I worked too much. I was not always present, even when I was present. Clara told me that more than once, and she was right. He paused. I'm not telling you that as a warning. I'm telling you because you should know who you're dealing with. Moss, she said quietly. I'm also not the man I was when she said it, he said. I think. I hope. I'm not certain of that the way I'd want to be certain of it, but I'm working on it. He stopped again. He looked at the hay bale, then at her. I'm asking you something without quite managing to say it plainly, which is, I know what you're asking, she said. The barn was very quiet. Outside, a horse moved in the near pasture, wind along the eave. I'm not going to make it easy, she said. I don't mean that as a threat. I mean it as a fact. I've been doing everything on my own terms for a long time, and that's not something I'm going to put down because it's convenient. I'm not asking you to, he said. I know, but I want it said clearly. She looked at him. And I don't want to be managed. If something's wrong, I want to hear it from you directly. Not around it, not through someone else. Directly. You'll get that, he said. And if I think something's wrong, you'll hear it from me directly, whether you want to or not. I've been getting that for 3 months, he said, and she heard the dry warmth in it. Then you know what you're agreeing to, she said. He held her gaze. I do. She looked at him. This man who had given her work when she had nothing, who had hesitated when she needed him not to, and then crossed a ravine to apologize, who carried his grief like a stone he'd stopped trying to put down, and had finally, slowly, started setting on the ground. He was not easy. She was not easy. That wasn't a problem she needed solving. That was just the truth of two people who had been through enough to stop pretending they were simpler than they were. All right, she said. He let out a breath that was small and quiet, and that she understood was the sound of a man who had been braced for a different answer. All right, he said. They sat in the barn for a few more minutes and talked about the feed projections and the winter preparations and the south fence section that Reuben had identified as still needing work, because they were who they were, and the ranch was the ranch, and the world didn't stop requiring attention just because something important had happened inside it. That was fine. She had never needed the world to stop. She'd only needed it to give her enough room to move. December came in hard and cold the way Texas December sometimes does, not with the gradual politeness of northern winters, but with a single sharp drop that arrived overnight and changed everything by morning. She woke to frost on the inside of her bunkhouse window and the particular sound of horses who were cold and wanted to say so, and she was out the door into the corrals before the breakfast bell, with extra blankets and the focused purpose of someone who knows exactly what the day requires. The ranch hands were right behind her. That was different from September. Worth noting. Obsidian's leg had healed enough for full work by the beginning of December, and on the first morning she rode him properly. Real work, a real ride, asking him for things, and having him give them. She took him out to the far pasture where there was nobody watching and let herself do what she'd been building toward for 3 months. She asked him for a canter. He went forward with the ease of something that had been waiting for the question, and she sat into it and felt the ground moving under them and the cold air and the flat Texas sky going on forever in every direction. And she didn't think about Cincinnati or the boarding house or Silas Croft's letters or 53 cents or a wedding dress still folded in a flour sack at the bottom of her trunk. She thought about nothing. She just rode. When she came back, Moss was at the pasture gate. He'd come out to see and had the expression of a man watching something he is glad is happening. She brought Obsidian down to a walk coming in, loose and easy, both of them warm from the work. "How did he feel?" Moss said. "Like himself," she said. "Like he was always supposed to feel." Moss put his hand on the horse's neck. Obsidian turned and investigated his jacket pocket with his nose, found nothing, and made a sound that was approximately dignified offense. Nell laughed. It surprised her, the laugh. Not because it was unusual, but because it was entirely unguarded in a way she hadn't heard from herself in a long time. Moss looked at her with something on his face that was uncomplicated and warm, and she didn't look away from it. The town of Redemption took longer to come around than the ranch had, which was predictable. Towns are slower than people and more stubborn about the stories they've decided on, because the story serves a function for the people in it. It organizes the world into recognizable shapes, and reorganizing it requires effort that most people would rather not expend. What reorganized Redemption was not a single event. It was accumulation. It was the winter when Hollister Ranch was the only operation in the county that didn't lose horses to the cold snap, because Nell had pushed hard on the winter preparations in November, and the horses were blanketed and sheltered and fed correctly when the temperature dropped. Word of that got around the way practical information always got around in agricultural communities. Through the feed store, through the conversations men had while waiting for things, through the quiet accounting of who had been right and who hadn't. It was Doc Weller who had taken to mentioning her name in consultations when other ranchers and farmers described problems she'd helped solve on Hollister Ranch. He did not present it as advertisement. He presented it as fact, the way he presented everything, and fact had a way of accumulating into reputation that couldn't be constructed any other way. It was Caleb, the 15-year-old who had told the truth about Jed Calloway, who grew over the winter into someone slightly older and slightly less frightened, and who told the story, truthfully, without embellishment, to his family when he went home for Christmas, and whose family told other people, and so on, in the way that true stories travel when they're given room. And it was Nell herself who went into Redemption for supplies and ranch business and walked through the town with the same steady, unremarkable presence she'd developed for walking across the Hollister Ranch yard. Neither aggressive nor apologetic, just there, doing what she'd come to do, speaking when spoken to, and not performing anything in either direction. Mrs. Gable did not become warm. That was probably too much to ask, and Nell didn't ask it. But sometime in February, the woman stopped making a point of looking away when Nell walked past her shop, which was its own kind of progress. The Reverend's wife invited her to Sunday dinner in January. She went and sat at a table with 5 other people and had a meal that was very good and a conversation that was occasionally uncomfortable, and left with the understanding that the Reverend's wife had decided, for her own reasons, to come down on Nell's side of things. She didn't know exactly why. She appreciated it without requiring the explanation. Spring came early to that part of Texas, which it sometimes did, the way a place that has been harsh sometimes surprises you with a generosity that seems disproportionate to what came before. The pastures went green faster than she'd expected, and the horses responded to it with the specific energy of animals who have been cold and are suddenly completely warm, an exuberance that required management and was wonderful to watch requiring it. She was riding Obsidian along the south fence line on a March afternoon when she found the thing she hadn't been looking for. Not a problem with the fence. The south fence was solid, the new posts holding exactly as they should. What she found was a cluster of new growth at the base of a section of the old fence, the particular aggressive green of something that was going to become a problem if left alone. She got off to look at it more closely, which was how she ended up crouching in the dirt at the base of a fence post on a Tuesday afternoon, realizing that what she'd ridden out here to check had been fine, and what she'd found instead was something else entirely. She looked at it for a while. She thought about how things worked. Not just plants, not just ranches, but the whole structure of how change happened. Slowly, at the base of things, in places you weren't looking, requiring attention not because you'd planned to give it there, but because you happened to be close enough to notice. She pulled the growth up at the roots. She remounted obsidian and finished the fence line. Moss was in the kitchen when she got back, doing the books. He did the books at the kitchen table rather than at the desk in the study that had been built for exactly that purpose, because he'd told her once that the study had been where Clara kept her things, and he'd never fully reorganized it into something else. And so the books happened at the kitchen table. She came in and poured herself water and told him about the growth at the south fence. "I'll have Reuben take a look this week," he said. "I already marked the location," she said. "I can take whoever you want out there to deal with it tomorrow if the weather holds." "Take Cord," he said. "He knows that section." She drank her water. He kept working on the books. The kitchen had the early spring afternoon coming in through the window over the sink, and outside she could hear Tommy doing something in the near yard that involved more noise than was strictly necessary, and somewhere farther out a horse calling to another horse across the pasture. "Moss," she said. "The bunkhouse room." He looked up. "The nail in the wall finally pulled out," she said. "The one I've been hanging my coat on. Took the chunk of plaster around it with it. I've been meaning to mention it." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to know as him, understanding more than what was literally being said. "I'll have someone fix the nail," he said. "Or," she said. He put his pen down. "The room at the end of the east hall," she said. "It's been a storage room since I got here, but there's a window that gets morning light, and the structure is sound, and it's twice the size of what I have." He was quiet for a moment. "It's in the main house." "I'm aware of where it is," she said. "People will talk," he said. "People are going to talk regardless," she said. "The question is whether we're going to let what people talk about determine how we live." She held his gaze. "I'm not suggesting anything that's anyone else's business. I'm suggesting a room in the East Hall that has good morning light and a nail in the wall that hasn't fallen out." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's a very practical way to frame it." "I'm a practical person." "You are," he said. "Among other things." The warmth in it was quiet and real. "When would you want to move?" "When someone fixes the nail in the bunkhouse, the room is ready," she said. "Whichever comes first." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'll see about the East Hall room tomorrow." "That's what I thought," she said. She went back outside. Obsidian was in the near pasture looking at her over the fence rail with the expression horses get when they know they've been talked about, which was obviously not true but felt true, and she went over and put her hand on his neck and stood there in the March afternoon letting herself be exactly where she was. She thought about what it meant to find a place. Not to be assigned one, not to be given one by virtue of who you married or who your family was or how long you'd been standing in one spot, but to build it from scratch, with your hands and your patience and your absolute refusal to let anyone tell you that the thing you were capable of was less than what you were actually capable of. She had been told that, in various ways, her whole life, by her father's second wife, by the boarding house owner in Missouri, by every closed door in Redemption when she'd arrived with nothing, by Jed Calloway, who had seen her capability clearly enough to be threatened by it and had chosen, in the end, a betrayal that said more about what he feared than what he knew. She had not become what those people decided she was. That was the thing she wanted to hold on to, not as pride but as fact. The distinction between what people assign you and what you actually are. It was the thing she would have told herself at 31, sitting on a trunk in a street in a town that didn't know her. It was the thing she would have told the girl who grew up in an Ohio farmhouse learning to read horses because horses, at least, responded to what you actually did rather than what someone had already decided about you. The world was not fair. She had known that at 8 years old. Fairness was not something the world distributed. It was something people created in small, specific ways through the decisions they made about how to treat each other. Some people created it, and some people didn't, and the ratio had never, in her experience, been particularly encouraging. But here it was anyway. Here she was anyway. She heard Moss come out the back door of the house and cross the yard, and without turning around she knew his particular footfall now, the even pace of him, and she heard him stop at the fence rail a few feet from her. "Reuben wants to know about the rotational grazing schedule for April," he said. "Tell him I'll have it worked out by Friday," she said. "The east pasture needs another 2 weeks before we put horses on it again." "He said you'd say that." "Then why did he ask?" "Because he wanted confirmation, not information," Moss said. "There's a difference." She looked at him. He was leaning on the rail with the ease of a man who had stopped performing relaxation and was actually experiencing it, which had taken most of the winter to develop, and which she valued more than he probably knew. "Did he say anything else?" she said. "He said the feed ratios for the yearlings you adjusted last month have made a visible difference, and he was wrong to question them." "Reuben said he was wrong?" "He said you were right," Moss said. Which is Reuben's way of saying he was wrong without committing to the full version. She smiled. "I'll take it." "You take a lot of half measures very graciously," he said. "I take what's real," she said. "Half genuine is better than fully performed." He looked at her in the way he sometimes did, that she'd stopped trying to interpret too precisely, because the precise interpretation made her feel like she was moving faster than she'd decided to move. And she was still, even now, after everything, careful about that. Not from fear exactly, from the particular caution of someone who has lost things she thought were certain and has learned to distinguish between what's solid and what just looks solid from a distance. What she knew was solid: this land, this work, this horse under her hand, the feed projection she'd written out, the fence line she'd ridden this afternoon. Tommy's face when he learned something new about horses, which was still the most uncomplicated thing on this property. Reuben saying she was right. Cord checking in about the bay gelding without being asked. What she was still learning to trust as solid, this man beside her, who had hesitated and apologized and meant it, who was working on himself with the same practical determination he brought to everything else, who sat at the kitchen table to do the books, and had offered her a room in the East Hall and didn't ask her to be simpler than she was. She was still learning. That was all right. "What are you thinking about?" Moss said. "The April rotation," she said. He was quiet. Then, with the specific tone of someone who knows they're not being told everything and has decided not to push. "Right." She looked at him. "And other things," she said. He nodded slowly. The afternoon light was doing something particular to the pasture just then, the long March sun at the angle that made the green look deeper than it was, and the distances look closer, and Obsidian was moving along the fence line with the loose, easy movement of an animal that had forgotten he was supposed to be frightened of everything. "He looks good," Moss said, watching the horse. "He looks like himself," she said. "That's the best thing I can say about any of them." They stood at the fence until the light started going and the temperature dropped in that quick, decisive way of early spring evenings, and then they walked back to the house together, not touching, not needing to, just walking side by side across the yard that she had crossed alone on her first morning with nowhere to go and nothing decided. The bunkhouse room would be empty by the end of the week. She didn't know yet exactly what the East Hall room would mean. She had a reasonable sense of what she hoped it would mean, and she had learned enough to be honest with herself about the difference between hope and certainty, and to live in the space between them without it destroying her. That was the thing she had learned. Not here, not only here, but most clearly here, that you could not wait for certainty. You could not wait until you were sure that the ground would hold before you put your weight on it. You had to do the thing while the outcome was still uncertain. You had to ride the horse before you knew he was going to let you. You had to walk into the corral when the men thought it was impossible. You had to keep moving when everything was stacked against you, and all the evidence was wrong, and the only thing you had to go on was the knowledge of what you were capable of, and the refusal to let anyone else set the limit on that. She had crossed the country for something settled. She had found something better. Not easier. Not perfect. A man who was still learning to trust his own judgment, on a ranch that was still finding its footing without the structure that had held it for 14 years, in a county that was still deciding what story it wanted to tell about her. But real. Built out of real things, work and patience and the willingness to stay when leaving would have been so much simpler. She hung her coat on the hook inside the back door. The hook held, this one had always held, and washed her hands at the basin and came to the table where the books were spread out and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Moss and kept one for herself. He looked up. "South fence section," she said. "While I'm thinking about it, we should replace that entire run before summer, not just spot repairs." I was thinking the same thing, he said. I know, she said. Reuben knows too. He just wants someone to say it officially. Moss picked up his pen. I'll put it in the spring budget. She sat across from him and drank her coffee and looked at the books spread between them, the accounts of a working life written out in columns and figures. And outside the window, the last of the March light was going off the pastures. And somewhere out there, Obsidian was grazing in the near dark, with the contented self-possession of an animal who had been given what he needed and had become, finally, exactly what he was always capable of being. She thought, this is what it looks like. Not the version she'd imagined from Cincinnati. Not the version Silas Croft's careful letters had sketched out. Not any version she'd been handed by someone else's idea of what a woman's life should look like if she was lucky. This. The books on the table and the coffee in her hand and the work still ahead, and the man across from her who had clean boots most days, but not always, who did the accounts at the kitchen table because some rooms still held things he was working through, who had told her she would hear hard things directly, and who meant it, and who she believed. She had not been claimed at a stagecoach. She had built something no stagecoach arrival could have given her. That was the difference. That was everything.